Hello, my dear friends. Welcome to another soothing journey through the shadowed corners of history, where we uncover the lives of those who toiled in the margins, their stories whispered in the quiet of the night. Tonight, we step into the dim, flickering light of medieval brothels, where hygiene was not a luxury but a desperate act of survival, often painful, always inadequate, and never enough to shield these women from the relentless grind of their existence. These women, bound by necessity, wiped their bodies with harsh alcohol, scrubbed with rags that carried the grime of countless hands, and faced another client moments later, their skins still stinging, their spirits heavy with the weight of another day. The air around them was a suffocating shroud, thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and unwashed skin, a constant reminder of their endless toil. There was no rest, no clean water, no mercy, just the unyielding expectation to keep going, to endure, to survive. Tonight, we'll immerse ourselves in the raw, grueling hygiene routines of medieval prostitutes, a story told in a steady, somber rhythm to lull you into sleep. Before you settle in, please like this video and subscribe if you find comfort in these calming historical tales. Now, dim the lights, let the hum of a fan or the soft strains of music fill the background, and join me as we step into a forgotten world, where every breath was a battle, and every moment a quiet act of resilience. Walking into a medieval brothel was like crossing a threshold into a world where the senses were assaulted before the mind could catch up. The door, often a heavy slab of warped wood, creaked on rusted hinges, groaning as if reluctant to reveal the scene within. The air hit first, a tangible force, a wall of odors so dense it seemed to cling to your skin, seeping into your clothes, your hair, your very thoughts. It was a miasma of sour sweat, stale wine, and something darker, unnameable, that settled in the back of your throat like a bitter aftertaste. The women who worked here met this smell before they met the eyes of their clients. It was their first greeting each day, their constant companion through endless nights, a presence that never faded, no matter how long they stayed. For newcomers, the stench was a shock, a visceral assault that made their stomachs churn and their hands fly to their mouths in a futile attempt to block it out. Some gagged, their shoulders heaving as they tried to breathe through the nausea, but no one offered comfort. A quick glance from the other's eyes sharp, then darting back to the floor was the only acknowledgement. Everyone had been there, everyone had learned to breathe through it, to let the air become part of them, to accept it as the backdrop of their lives. The room itself was a study in neglect, a space that seemed to absorb and amplify the misery of its inhabitants. The stone floors, cold and unyielding, were hidden beneath a shifting layer of dirt, straw, and stains that no one dared examine too closely. You stepped carefully, not because you knew what lay beneath your feet, but because you didn't want to know. The straw crunched underfoot, brittle and damp in places, carrying the faint, sour temps of spilled ale or worse. In some corners, the straw was matted, pressed flat by countless footsteps, its fibers darkened by time and use. The walls, rough-hewn stone or crumbling plaster, were blackened by the smoke of tallow lamps, their flickering flames casting uneven shadows that danced across the room. The smoke itself added a bitter, acrid note to the air, curling into the lungs, stinging the eyes, and leaving a faint film on everything it touched. There were no windows to offer relief, no fresh breeze to stir the stagnant air, only the heavy, oppressive weight of a room that seemed to close in on itself, trapping its occupants in a cycle of grime and despair. The women were given a dress, when they arrived, handed over without ceremony or explanation. It was a single garment, often a shapeless shift or a gown with frayed hems and patched seams, passed from one worker to another until the fabric was stiff with the accumulated sweat, blood, and tears of its previous wearers. The seams held the scent of countless nights, a faint musk that no amount of airing could dispel. The dress was never clean, its fibers saturated with a residue of bodies and labor. Underwear was a luxury most couldn't afford, a distant dream, for women whose every coin went to food, rent, or the brothel keeper's cut. Some tied a scrap of cloth between their legs, a makeshift barrier against the inevitable, but most didn't bother. The cloth was rarely washed, and when it was, the water was so scarce and dirty that it did little good. Shoes were even rarer bare. Feet moved faster over the gritty floor, though they paid the price in cuts, calluses, and blisters that never fully healed. The soles of their feet grew thick and hard, like leather, but the cracks and sores were a constant reminder of the ground they tread. In one corner of the room sat a basin, shallow and wide, its surface marred by rust or grime. It was filled with water, but calling it clean would be a lie. The water was shared by everyone, used for wiping faces, armpits, or groins in a hurried attempt at hygiene before the next client. By noon, the water was cloudy, flecked with dirt and skin, its surface shimmering with an oily sheen. It was rarely changed, sometimes not until someone, usually the newest girl, still clinging to some shred of hope, couldn't stand it anymore and hauled it outside to dump. A jug of vinegar or cheap wine might sit nearby, its sharp scent cutting through the air. The women dipped their rags into it, wincing as the liquid burned raw skin, hoping it would mask the smell or kill whatever lingered. It didn't clean. Not really. It just stung enough to feel like progress. a fleeting illusion of control in a world that offered none. The rags themselves were another story, torn strips of old dresses or blankets, reused until they frayed into uselessness. They were never truly clean, carrying the residue of every body they'd touched, every surface they'd wiped. The beds were no better, if you could call them beds. They were little more than piles of straw heaped on the floor, sometimes covered with a thin sack or a scrap of coarse cloth. Blankets, when they existed, were shared among the women, damp and heavy with the weight of too many bodies. The straw at the bottom was always wet, soaking up whatever spilled or seeped sweat, blood, wine, or worse. Some women tried to mask the smell, burning dried herbs like rosemary or thyme in a small clay pot, waving the smoke over the bedding in a futile attempt at freshness. The herbs gave a brief reprieve, a faint, fleeting scent that was almost pleasant, but the stench always returned, creeping back like a tide. There were no windows to let in light or air, no mirrors to reflect their faces, only a single candle, shared among a dozen women or more, its weak flame flickering in the gloom. When it burned out, the night was over, though the darkness lingered, in more ways than one. The heat in the room didn't come from a fire but from the press of bodies, 10, 12, sometimes more, crowded into a single space, breathing, sweating, coughing. The air grew thick, heavy with the warmth of human struggle, and silence settled only when exhaustion won out, broken by the occasional groan, the scratch of nails on itching skin, or the soft slap of a bare foot on stone as someone stumbled. To the bucket. The bucket was its own grim reality, tucked behind a tattered curtain if the brothel could afford one. It was always full by morning, its contents sloshing dangerously close to the rim. If it tipped, the mess spread across the floor, soaking into the straw, adding another layer to the room's ever-present stench. No one cleaned the floor properly. They just swept the worst of it into a corner or avoided the wet spots altogether. By the third day, a new girl stopped flinching at the sight. She learned to step around the stains, to breathe through her mouth, to ignore the itch of lice crawling through her hair or across her skin. Meals were sparse and simple: bread, often stale, and a watery stew that was more broth than substance. On good days there might be a sip of wine, sour and thin, passed around in a shared cup. Hands that wiped bodies were the same ones used to tear bread or scoop stew, with no rag changed in between. The act of eating was mechanical, a necessity squeezed between clients, with no time for care or cleanliness. Hair was another battle, one fought with little hope of victory. Without brushes or oil, it became a tangled mass by the second night, knotted with sweat and grime. Some women tied it back with string or tore strips from a blanket to hold it in place. Lice were inevitable, their bites a constant irritation that no amount of scratching could relieve. Some shaved their heads, rubbing ash or soot into their scalps to dull the itch, though it did little to stop the crawling. Water was too precious to waste on hair. It was reserved for wiping the body, and even that was a luxury. The mouth was its own war zone, a place where decay and neglect took root. There were no toothbrushes, no pastages, mint leaves or pine twigs if they were lucky enough to find them. Most didn't bother letting their lips crack and their gums bleed, their breath heavy with the weight of hunger and rot. Some rubbed salt on their teeth, scraping with a finger or a stick, wincing at the sting but hoping it would scrub away the worst. It hurt, but it was better than nothing. A small act of defiance against the body's slow surrender. Periods were no excuse for rest, no pause in the relentless cycle of work. Women bled into rags, reused and rarely washed, tucked between their legs with practiced efficiency. Welcome back, my dear friends, to the quiet, shadowed corners of history, where we linger in the lives of those who moved through the world unseen, their stories carried on the soft breath of the night. As you settle into the gentle hum of a fan or the faint strains of music, let the weight of the medieval brothel wrap around you once more, a heavy but steady blanket that guides you towards sleep. In our last journey, we walked through the dim, stifling rooms where women endured the relentless grind of survival. Their hygiene a series of painful, inadequate acts, wiping with dirty rags, stinging their skin with vinegar, breathing air thick with sweat and despair. Tonight, we delve deeper into their world, exploring how these women were forced to clean not for their own comfort or dignity, but for the men who paid for their time. This act of washing, demanded by clients or brothel keepers, was not about care but control, not about cleanliness but compliance, and it came with its own kind of pain, its own quiet cost. Picture the flickering candle, the soft drip of water, the rustle of straw underfoot, and let the rhythm of their story carry you gently into sleep. If you're finding solace in these tales, please like this video and subscribe. And now, let's step back into that forgotten world, where every act was a struggle, and every moment a testament to resilience. In the medieval brothel, hygiene was not a personal choice but a performance, a ritual dictated by the demands of men who saw the women not as individuals but as objects to be shaped to their desires. The act of cleaning was not for the women's benefit. It offered no relief, no sense of renewal, but for the satisfaction of clients who wanted the illusion of purity. Even in a place where filth was inescapable, the brothel keeper, often a woman hardened by years in the trade or a man driven by profit, enforced this ritual with a sharp eye and a sharper tongue. "Wash," they'd bark, pointing to the basin in the corner, its water already murky from the hands of others. The women complied, not out of hope for cleanliness, but because refusal could mean a lost coin, a bruised cheek, or a night without food. The basin, shallow and pitted with rust, sat like a grim sentinel, its contents a cloudy stew of dirt, skin, and despair. To dip a rag into it was to invite the grime of others onto your own body. Yet they did it. Their movements mechanical, their faces blank, their minds somewhere else. The water in the basin was rarely fresh, often carried in from a nearby well or river by the youngest or newest girl, her arms trembling under the weight of a wooden bucket that sloshed with every step. By the time it reached the basin, it was already tainted, specked with dust from the street, flecked with mud from the bucket's cracked interior. The women gathered around it, a silent assembly of shadows in the dim light, each waiting her turn to dip a rag or a hand into the tepid liquid. The rag was often a scrap torn from a discarded dress, its edges frayed, its surface stiff with the residue of countless uses. To touch it was to feel the weight of every hand that had held it before, every body it had wiped, every stain it had absorbed. The women scrubbed their faces, their necks, their groins, their movements quick and practiced, driven by the need to satisfy the next man who walked through the door. The water stung where skin was raw, where cuts or sores had begun to fester, but they pressed on, knowing that to hesitate was to invite scrutiny, to risk being marked as unclean, unfit, unwanted. For some clients, the act of washing was part of the transaction, a ritual they demanded to see performed. A man might stand in the doorway, his eyes glinting in the candlelight, watching as a woman dipped her rag into the basin, her hands moving, with a deliberate slowness that masked her exhaustion. "Clean yourself," he'd say, his voice low, expectant, as if the act were a prelude to his pleasure rather than a necessity for her survival. She would comply, her rag tracing paths across her skin, the water leaving a faint sheen that caught the light but did little to cleanse. The vinegar, when available, was where its sharp bite burned against open wounds, making her wince, though she learned to hide the pain behind a blank stare or a forced smile. The men didn't care about the dirt that lingered, the lice that crawled, the sores that wept. They cared only for the appearance of cleanliness, the fleeting illusion that their coin had bought something pure. For the women, it was another layer of labor, another moment where their bodies were not their own, where even the act of washing was stripped of agency and turned into a performance for someone else's gaze. The brothel keeper often kept a jug of cheap wine or diluted vinegar near the basin, not for drinking but for dousing. "It kills the rot," they'd say, though no one believed it, not really. The liquid was poured sparingly, a precious commodity in a place where every resource was scarce. The women dabbed it onto their skin, the sharp scent cutting through the room's heavy air, mingling with the smoke of tallow lamps and the musk of unwashed body. It burned, oh, how it burned! Raw skin screamed under its touch. Cracked hands trembled as they pressed the rag to armpits or thighs. But they endured, because to flinch too visibly was to invite questions, to risk a client's complaint or a keeper's wrath. That vinegar was not about hygiene but about masking, about creating a scent that could for a moment overpower the room's relentless stench. It was a lie they all agreed to, a shared pretense that allowed the work to continue, the coins to change hands, the night to move forward. The rags themselves were a source of endless toil, when one became too tattered, too saturated with grime to be of use. The women tore new strips from whatever they could find, an old blanket, a discarded shift, even the hem of their own dress if they were desperate. These rags were never washed properly. There was no time, no water, no will to do so. Instead, they were dipped into the basin, wrung out, and used again, carrying the residue of every body, every night, every moment of labor. Some women tried to rinse them in the river when they could, slipping out in the early morning hours when the streets were quiet, their hands numb from the cold water as they scrubbed the cloth against rocks. But the river was often as dirty as the basin, its surface slick with the city's waste, and the rags came back only marginally cleaner, still heavy with the weight of their use. To hold one was to feel the history of the brothel in your hands, a tactile reminder of the countless women who had come before, who had wiped and worked and waited in the same dim rooms. The act of cleaning was not just physical but emotional, a quiet erosion of the self. Each time a woman scrubbed her skin for a man's approval, she gave away a piece of her autonomy, a fragment of her dignity. The men didn't see her as a person but as a body to be prepared, a surface to be polished for their use. The brothel keeper reinforced this, their voice sharp as they ordered the women to wash before each client, to present themselves as if they could erase the room's filth with a single rag. The women learned to move quickly, to make the act look effortless, even as their hands shook from cold or fatigue, even as their skin burned from the vinegar's sting. They learned to tilt their heads just so, to let the candlelight catch the damp sheen of their skin, to create the illusion that the client demanded. It was a performance, nothing more, but it was one they had to perfect, because failure meant less coin, less food, less chance of surviving another day. The pain of this washing was not just in the act itself but in what it represented. To clean for a man was to acknowledge that your body was not yours, that your comfort was irrelevant, that your worth was measured only by his satisfaction. The women felt this in their bones, in the ache of their hands as they gripped the rag, in the sting of their skin as they scrubbed, in the weight of their silence as they worked. Some whispered to each other in the quiet moments, their voices low, sharing tricks to make the vinegar hurt less, to make the rag feel softer, to make the act bearable. Press lightly, one might say, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the candle. Don't let it soak too long, another might add, her fingers tracing the edge of a sore that had never healed. These were small acts of resistance, tiny moments of solidarity in a place that sought to strip them of both. They shared what they could, not because it changed their reality, but because it reminded them they were not alone, that they were more than the sum of their labor. The brothel's rhythm was relentless, a cycle of washing, working, waiting that left no room for rest. The women moved from one client to the next, their hands still damp from the basin, their skin still tingling from the vinegar. The straw beneath their feet grew damper with each passing hour, the air heavier with each breath. The candle burned lower, its wax pooling in uneven drips, marking the passage of time in a place where time seemed to stand still. The men came and went, their faces blurring into a single, indistinct presence, their demands a constant hum in the background. The women washed, not because they believed it made a difference, but because it was expected, because it was one more task in a life defined by tasks. The basin, the rag, the vinegar, they were tools of survival, not sanitation, wielded with a grim determination that spoke to the women's resilience, their ability to endure in a world that offered no mercy. We explored the forced rituals of hygiene, how the women scrubbed their skin not for themselves but for the men who demanded the illusion of purity. Each act of washing a painful surrender to the brothel's relentless demands. Tonight, we delve deeper into their world, examining the tools they used, the combs, the herbs, the makeshift remedies, and how these small acts of care were both a burden and a quiet rebellion, a way to reclaim some fragment of their humanity, in a place that sought to strip it away. Picture the flickering candle, the soft rustle of straw, the faint scent of herbs burning in a clay pot, and let the rhythm of their story carry you gently into sleep. If you're finding solace in these tales, please like this video and subscribe. And now, let's step back into that forgotten world, where every act was a struggle, and every moment a testament to resilience. In the medieval brothel, the tools of hygiene were not instruments of comfort but relics of necessity, pieced together from whatever scraps the women could find or barter. There were no polished mirrors, no soft brushes, no fragrant soaps, only crude, makeshift items that carried the weight of their labor. The combs were perhaps the most cherished, though they were far from the delicate tools of wealthier households. These were rough, hand-carved objects, often made from bone or wood, their teeth uneven and splintered, prone to snapping if pressed too hard against tangled hair. A comb was a rarity, passed down from one woman to another, its surface worn smooth by countless hands, its edges darkened by the oils of scalps and the grime of the room. To use it was an act of patience, a slow, painful process of tugging through matted hair, each snag pulling at the scalp, sometimes drawing blood. The women sat in a circle during the rare moments of quiet, one comb shared among them, their fingers careful as they worked through knots, their faces tight with concentration. The act was not about vanity, but survival. Tangled hair attracted lice, and lice brought itching, sores, and the risk of a client's disgust, which could mean a lost coin or a harsh word from the brothel keeper. The combs were often gifts, not from kindness but from necessity. A woman might receive one from a client, a crude token tossed her way after a night's work, or she might barter for it with a scrap of bread or a sip of wine. Some made their own, whittling a piece of wood with a stolen knife, their hands trembling from hunger or cold as they carved. The teeth were never even, and the wood was rough, splintering into the scalp with each stroke, but it was better than nothing. To lose a comb was a small tragedy, a loss felt deeply in a place where possessions were few and personal items fewer. When a comb broke, the women mourned it silently, their fingers tracing the jagged remains, knowing it would be weeks or months before they could replace it. Some used their fingers instead, raking through their hair with cracked nails, pulling out knots and lice with a grim determination that spoke of their endurance. The act was painful, the scalp tender from days of neglect, but they persisted, knowing that to stop was to let the lice win, to let the brothel's filth claim another piece of them. Herbs were another tool, a faint echo of the remedies used in villages or monasteries, but in the brothel they were scarce and precious. Rosemary, thyme, and mint were the most common, gathered from the edges of the city or traded from a passing merchant for a favor or a coin. The women kept them in small cloth sacks, tucked into the folds of their dresses or hidden beneath the straw bedding, guarding them like treasures. To use them was to invite a moment of relief, a fleeting scent that cut through the room's heavy air, a reminder of fields and forests far from the brothel's walls. They burned the herbs in clay pots or crushed them between their fingers, rubbing the leaves into their scalps or skin, hoping to mask the stench or soothe an itch. The smoke from burning herbs curled upward, mingling with the tallow lamps, acrid haze, creating a brief illusion of freshness that faded as quickly as it came. The herbs were never enough. There were too many women, too many needs, and too little to go around, but they used them sparingly, stretching each leaf, each stem, as far as it could go. The act of using herbs was both a burden and a rebellion. It was a burden because it required effort, time, and resources that the women could ill afford. Gathering herbs meant sneaking out before dawn, risking the brothel keeper's wrath or the city's dangers, their bare feet cold against the cobblestones, as they searched for a patch of green in the urban sprawl. Crushing them meant stained fingers, the juice stinging cracked skin, the scent lingering just long enough to remind them of what they'd lost. Burning them meant finding a pot, a spark, a moment of stillness in a place that allowed none. Yet, it was a rebellion because it was a choice, however small, a decision to claim a piece of their bodies, their senses, their memories. When a woman rubbed mint into her scalp, she wasn't just fighting lice. She was fighting the brothel's claim on her, asserting that she was more than a body for hire, more than a rag or a basin. When she burned rosemary, the smoke was a quiet defiance, a signal that she could still create something beautiful, even in a place that sought to crush beauty underfoot. Makeshift remedies were the women's final defense, a patchwork of knowledge, passed down through whispers and necessity. Without access to physicians or apothecaries, they relied on what they knew from their mothers, their grandmothers, or the women who had come before them in the brothel. Ash was a common remedy, rubbed into the scalp to dull the itch of lice or smeared onto sores to dry them out. It was gritty, staining their hands and hair, leaving a faint gray film that never fully washed away. Some mixed it with vinegar, creating a paste that burned but seemed to help, at least for a day or two. Others used urine, their own or another's, dabbing it onto cuts or rashes in the belief that it could heal. The smell was sharp, mingling with the room's existing stench, but they endured it, driven by desperation and the faint hope that it might work. These remedies were crude, often painful, and rarely effective. But they were all the women had a way to fight the body's slow decay, to hold back the infections that thrived in the brothel's filth. The burden of these remedies was heavy. Every act of care required energy, resources, and time, all of which were in short supply. To gather ash meant scraping the hearth, if the brothel had one, or stealing it from a nearby fire, risking burns or discovery. To use vinegar meant bartering with a keeper or a client, giving up a meal or a moment's rest for a few drops of the sour liquid. To apply urine meant overcoming shame, swallowing the revulsion that rose in the throat, and doing it anyway because there was no other choice. The women worked in silence, their hands steady as they mixed, rubbed, or dabbed, their faces blank, to hide the pain. But these acts were also a rebellion, a refusal to let the brothel's conditions define them entirely. Each remedy, however crude, was a claim to agency, a statement that they could still care for themselves, even if no one else did. When a woman shared a pinch of ash or a sprig of mint with another, it was a gesture of solidarity, a reminder that they were bound not just by their labor but by their shared struggle, their shared survival. The tools themselves, the combs, the herbs, the remedies, were not just objects but symbols of the women's resilience. To use a comb was to fight against the chaos of the brothel, to impose order on a body that was constantly violated. To burn herbs was to create a moment of beauty, however fleeting, in a place that thrived on ugliness. To apply a remedy was to assert that their bodies mattered, even if the world around them disagreed. These acts were small, often invisible, to the men who came and went, but they were profound in their quiet defiance. The women moved through their tasks with a steady rhythm, their hands working even as their minds drifted to memories of better times, fields of green, the laughter of a sister, the warmth of a mother's touch. These memories were as much a tool as the combs or herbs, a way to anchor themselves in a place that sought to untether them from everything they had been. The brothel's rhythm was unrelenting, a cycle of combing, rubbing, healing that blended into the larger cycle of washing, working, waiting. The women moved from one task to the next, their hands never still, their bodies never fully their own. The candle burned lower, its light casting long shadows across the straw, marking the passage of another night. The air grew thicker, heavy, with the scent of herbs, ash, and sweat, a reminder of the endless labor that defined their days. The men came and went, their faces a blur, their demands a constant hum in the background. The women cared for themselves as best they could, not because it made them clean, but because it made them human, because it gave them a reason to keep going. The combs, the herbs, the remedies, they were tools of survival, wielded with a grim determination that spoke to the women's strength, their ability to endure in a world that offered no mercy. In our last journey, we explored the tools of survival, the combs, the herbs, the makeshift remedies, and how these small acts of care were both a burden and a quiet rebellion, a way for the women to reclaim some fragment of their humanity. Tonight, we delve deeper into their world, into the rare moments of rest, the fleeting pauses between clients, and how the women found ways to reclaim their bodies and spirits in the shadows of the brothel. These moments, scarce and hard-won, were not just breaks from labor but acts of defiance, slivers of time where they could be more than the sum of their work. Picture the dim room, the flickering candle, the soft rustle of straw, and let the rhythm of their story carry you gently into sleep. If you're finding solace in these tales, please like this video and subscribe. And now, let's step back into that forgotten world, where every pause was a treasure, and every moment a testament. 2. Resilience. In the medieval brothel, rest was not a right but a rarity, a stolen breath in a life defined by relentless motion. The women lived in a cycle of washing, working, and waiting, their days and nights blending into a blur of labor that left little room for pause. Yet, in the cracks of this grueling routine, there were moments, brief, fragile, and fiercely got. They could stop, breathe, and reclaim a piece of themselves. These pauses came not from the generosity of the brothel keeper or the kindness of clients, but from the women's own determination to carve out space in a world that offered none. They might come in the early morning, when the last client had stumbled out and the first had yet to arrive, or in the late afternoon, when the brothel was quiet, its air heavy with the weight of the day. These moments were never guaranteed, often interrupted by a shout from the keeper or the creak of the door. But when they came, the women seized them with a quiet intensity, knowing they might not come again for hours, days, or even weeks. The physical act of resting was a challenge in itself. The brothel offered no soft beds, no quiet corners, no true sanctuary. The women made do with the straw piles that served as beds, their surfaces damp and uneven, littered with the residue of countless nights. To rest was to find a spot less soaked, less stained, where the straw was still dry enough to offer some comfort. They would sit or lie down, their bodies sinking into the coarse fibers, their hands folded over their stomachs or tucked beneath their heads to shield them from the itch of lice or the bite of fleas. The straw crunched softly under their weight, a faint sound that mingled with the distant drip of water from the basin or the low crackle of a dying candle. The air was thick, heavy with the sense of smoke, sweat, and herbs, but in these moments, it seemed to settle, to grow still, as if the room itself paused to let them breathe. Rest was not just about the body but about the spirit, a chance to reclaim the self from the brothel's relentless demands. In these pauses, the women might sit together, their shoulders brushing in the dim light, their voices low as they shared stories, memories, or nothing at all. Silence was as much a part of these moments as speech, a shared understanding that words were not always needed to connect. One woman might hum a tune, a fragment of a song from a village left behind, its melody soft and uneven, carrying the weight of homesickness. Another might braid a companion's hair, her fingers moving slowly through the tangled strands, not to tame them but to offer touch that was gentle, not demanding. These acts were small, almost invisible, but they were profound in their intimacy, a reminder that they were more than the labor they performed, more than the bodies the men paid for. The women found ways to care for their bodies in these stolen moments, not for the clients but for themselves. One might rub her hands with a scrap of cloth, easing the ache of cracked skin, her movements slow and deliberate, as if to savor the sensation of care. Another might press her fingers to her temples, massaging away the tension that had built over hours of forced smiles and quick washes. Some used the herbs they'd hoarded, rosemary, thyme, or mint, crushing a leaf between their fingers and holding it to their nose, inhaling deeply to block out the room's stench, if only for a moment. These acts were not about hygiene but about reclaiming their bodies, asserting that they could still feel, still care, still exist beyond the brothel's walls. The herb's faint scent was a rebellion, a refusal to let the air define them, a way to carry a piece of the outside world into the suffocating gloom. The pauses were also a time for memory, for reaching back to lives before the brothel. A woman might close her eyes and picture a field, the grass cool beneath her feet, the sky wide and blue above. She might recall a mother's voice, sharp but kind, teaching her to weave or cook, or a sister's laugh, bright and fleeting, from a time when laughter came easily. These memories were fragile, easily shattered by the creak of a door or the shout of the keeper. But they were precious, a lifeline to a self that the brothel could not fully erase. Some women whispered these memories to each other, their voices barely audible, sharing stories of rivers they'd swum in, markets they'd wandered, or festivals where they'd danced under torchlight. The stories were not always happy. Many carried the weight of loss, of choices made or taken away, but they were theirs, a thread of identity that the brothel's grind could not sever. These moments of rest were not without their burdens. 2. Pause was to risk the keeper's wrath, to invite a sharp word or a sharper blow. The brothel was a place of constant motion, and stillness was seen as laziness, a defiance of the work that kept the coins flowing. The women learned to rest in secret, their bodies angled to hide their idleness, their eyes darting to the door for signs of interruption. The straw was uncomfortable, its dampness seeping through their dresses, chilling their skin even in the room's stifling heat. The air, heavy with the day's labor, pressed against their lungs, making each breath a reminder of where they were. Yet they rested anyway, because to stop, even for a moment, was to reclaim something the brothel sought to take: their time, their bodies, their spirits. The women also used these pauses to care for each other, forging bonds that were as vital as the herbs or combs. One might clean a companion's cut, using a damp rag and a gentle touch, her fingers careful not to press too hard. Another might share a crust of bread, breaking it in half with cracked hands, offering it with a nod that spoke of understanding. These acts were small, often wordless, but they were a rebellion against the brothel's isolation, a refusal to let it divide them. They sat close, their knees touching, their breaths mingling, creating a warmth that the straw and the room could not provide. When one woman faltered, her body shaking from exhaustion or pain, another might rest a hand on her shoulder, a silent promise that she was not alone. These moments were fleeting, but they were enough to carry them through, enough to face another client, another rag, another night. The act of resting was a rebellion in itself, a quiet assertion that they were more than the work they did to sit still, to close their eyes, to hum a song or share a story was to defy the brothel's claim on their every moment. The women knew the risks, knew that rest could be snatched away, that the keeper's voice could cut through the silence, that a client's arrival could end their pause, but they rested anyway. Because they had to, because it was the only way to survive. They found corners of the room where the candle's light was dimmest, where the keeper's eyes might not reach, and they made them their own, if only for a moment. They leaned against the wall, its cold stone a relief against their aching backs, or curled into the straw, their bodies folding into themselves as if to shield their hearts from the world. The brothel's rhythm was unrelenting, a cycle of labor that left little room for anything else. But in these pauses, the women created their own rhythm, a slower, softer beat that carried them through the night. The candle burned low, its wax pooling in uneven drips, marking the passage of time in a place where time seemed to stand still. The air grew heavier, thick with a scent of straw, smoke, and the faint trace of herbs, but in these moments it seemed to soften, to offer a breath of something gentler. The women rested, not because they believed in rest, but because they believed in themselves, in their right to exist beyond the brothel's demands. They cared for each other, not because it changed their reality, but because it reminded them that they were human, that they were more than the sum of their labor. In our last journey, we explored the rare moments of rest, those fleeting pauses between clients, where the women reclaimed fragments of their bodies and spirits, weaving small acts of care and solidarity into the relentless grind of their days. Tonight, we delve deeper into their world, into the end of their nights, the moments when the candle burned out and the brothel fell silent, and how the women faced the darkness, both the literal darkness of the unlit room and the deeper shadows within their hearts. These moments, when the work paused and the world grew still, were both a relief and a reckoning, a time to confront the weight of their lives. Picture the dim room, the last flicker of a dying candle, the soft rustle of straw, and let the rhythm of their story carry you gently into sleep. If you're finding solace in these tales, please like this video and subscribe. And now, let's step back into that forgotten world, where every silence was a mirror, and every moment a testament to resilience. The end of the night in a medieval brothel was marked not by a clock but by the candle, a single, trembling flame shared among the women, its wax pooling in uneven drips on the stone floor. When it burned out, its final sputter casting the room into darkness, the night was over. The air seemed to shift, growing heavier, thicker, as if the absence of light allowed the weight of the day to settle fully. The brothel fell silent, or as silent as it could be. There was always a sound, a creak of wood, a distant cough, the faint slosh of the bucket in the corner. But in this moment, the clamor of clients, the keeper's sharp commands, the rustle of straw and the hurried feet all faded, leaving a stillness that was both a gift and a burden. For the women, this was the closest they came to rest, a pause that was not chosen but imposed by the exhaustion of their bodies and the limits of the candle's wax. Yet, it was also a time of reckoning, when the darkness brought not just relief but the weight of their thoughts, their memories, their unspoken fears. The physical act of ending the night was a ritual in itself, one born of necessity and habit. The women gathered their belongings, if they had any, a scrap of cloth, a broken comb, a small sack of herbs tucked into the folds of their dress. They moved slowly, their bodies aching from hours of standing, kneeling or lying on the damp straw. The floor was cold against their bare feet, its surface gritty with dirt and debris, but they stepped carefully, knowing where the worst stains lay, where the straw was slick with spilled wine or worse. Some sat on the edge of their straw piles, their hands folded in their laps, their eyes fixed on the spot where the candle's light had been, as if willing it to return. Others curled into the straw, pulling their dresses tight around them to ward off the chill that seeped through the walls. The straw was never comfortable, its fibers poking through thin cloth, its dampness clinging to their skin, but it was all they had, a makeshift bed that offered no softness, only the promise of a few hours' respite. The darkness was both a shield and a mirror. It hid the women from the world, from the client's gazes, from the keeper's watchful eyes, but it also forced them to face themselves. In the absence of light, their thoughts grew loud, memories and fears rising like ghosts from the shadows. A woman might think of a child left behind in a village, her face blurring with time but never fading entirely. Another might recall a mother's hands, rough but gentle, braiding her hair before the world turned hard. Some saw nothing but the brothel itself, its walls closing in even in their minds, the smell of sweat and smoke so ingrained that it followed them into their dreams. The darkness was a space where they could not escape themselves, where the weight of their lives pressed close, heavy with loss, with shame, with the stubborn spark of hope that refused to die. They lay still, their breaths shallow, their hearts beating in the quiet, each woman alone with her thoughts yet surrounded by others who shared the same silence. The silence was never complete. The brothel was a living thing, its walls creaking, its floor shifting under the weight of bodies and time. The bucket in the corner, always full by night's end, gave off a faint, sour smell that mingled with the lingering smoke of burned herbs and the musk of unwashed skin. A woman might stir, her foot brushing against the straw, the sound sharp in the stillness. Another might cough, her throat raw from the day's air, her chest tight with the weight of it all. Yet, these sounds were a kind of comfort, a reminder that they were not alone, that the darkness held not just their fears but their companions, their sisters in struggle. They listened to each other's breaths, to the soft rustle of movement, to the occasional whisper of a name or a prayer. And they found in these sounds a thread of connection, a lifeline in the night. In this darkness, the women sought small acts of care, not for hygiene but for survival of the spirit. One might reach for a rag, damp from the basin, and press it to her forehead, the coolness, a fleeting relief against the fever of exhaustion. Another might rub her hands together, warming the cracked skin, her fingers tracing the lines of scars and calluses as if mapping her own history. Some chewed a sprig of mint, its sharp taste cutting through the bitterness of their breath, a small act of defiance against the decay that surrounded them. These acts were not about cleanliness but about presence, about reminding themselves that they were still here, still human, still capable of feeling something other than pain. They might share a scrap of bread, saved from the day's meager meal, breaking it in the dark with careful fingers, the act of giving as vital as the food itself. These moments were fragile, easily shattered by a sound from the street or a stir from the keeper's room, but they were precious, a way to hold on to themselves in a place that sought to take everything. The darkness also brought dreams, or the fragments of dreams, fleeting images that flickered behind closed eyes. Some dreamed of freedom, of walking through fields where the air was clean and the sky was wide. Others dreamed of the brothel itself, its walls closing in, its smells choking their breath, their minds unable to escape even in sleep. The dreams were rarely kind, but they were. There's a space where the brothel could not fully reach. A woman might wake with a start, her heart pounding, her hands clutching the straw, only to find the darkness still there, the silence still heavy. She would lie back, her breath slowing, and listen to the sounds of her companions, their presence a reminder that she was not alone, that they were all bound by the same struggle, the same survival. The end of the night was also a time of preparation, a quiet readiness for the day to come. Some women used the darkness to mend their dresses, their fingers fumbling with a stolen needle and thread, patching holes that had torn during the day's work. Others sorted their herbs, feeling for the small sacks in the dark, counting the leaves to ensure they'd last another day. These tasks were done by touch, by memory, the women's hands moving with a practiced ease that belied their exhaustion. They worked in silence, not because they feared waking the others, but because words felt too heavy, too likely to break the fragile peace of the moment. The darkness was their shield, a brief respite from the eyes that watched them, the hands that demanded them, the voices that commanded them. In this space, they could be still, they could be themselves, if only for a few hours. Yet, the darkness was also a reckoning, a time when the weight of their lives could not be ignored. The women faced not just the physical darkness of the room but the deeper shadows within, the guilt of choices made or forced upon them, the grief of lives left behind, the fear of a future that looked no different from the present. Some prayed, their lips moving silently, their words a plea for strength, for forgiveness, for a way out. Others stared into the black, their eyes open but seeing nothing, their minds wrestling with thoughts too heavy to speak. The darkness was a mirror, reflecting their pain, their resilience, their refusal to be fully broken. They lay in the straw, their bodies curled against the cold, their hearts beating against the silence, and they endured, because endurance was all they had. As the night drew to a close, the first hints of dawn crept through the cracks in the walls, a faint gray light that softened the darkness but brought no warmth. The women stirred, their bodies stiff, their minds heavy with the weight of dreams and reality. They rose slowly, folding their dresses, smoothing the straw, preparing for another day of washing, working, waiting. The candle was gone, its wax hardened on the floor, but the brothel's rhythm would begin again, relentless and unyielding. Yet, in those final moments of darkness, the women had found something, a piece of themselves, a shared silence, a spark of life that the brothel could not extinguish. They faced the darkness, both within and without, and they carried on. their resilience a quiet rebellion against a world that sought to erase them. We explored the end of the night, the moments when the candle burned out and the brothel fell silent, and how the women faced the darkness, both the literal shadows of the room and the deeper shadows within their hearts. Tonight, we delve deeper into their world, into the dawn, the beginning of a new day, and how the women faced the cycle of labor once more, their spirits tempered by the night's silence. These moments, when the first light crept through the cracks and the brothel stirred to life, were a test of endurance, a time to gather strength for the relentless tasks ahead. Picture the dim room, the faint gray of dawn, the soft rustle of straw, and let the rhythm of their story carry you gently into sleep. If you're finding solace in these tales, please like this video and subscribe. And now, let's step back into that forgotten world, where every dawn was a challenge, and every moment a testament to resilience. The dawn in a medieval brothel was not a moment of renewal but a grim reminder of the cycle that never ended. As the first slivers of gray light slipped through the cracks in the walls or the gaps in a warped wooden shutter, the room seemed to exhale, its heavy air stirring with the promise of another day's labor. The women woke slowly, their bodies stiff from the damp straw, their eyes heavy with the weight of fragmented dreams. The silence of the night, so hard-won, was broken by the sounds of the waking world, the distant clatter of carts in the street, the muffled shouts of early risers, the creak of the brothel's door as the keeper stirred. The air was cold, sharper, now in the early morning, carrying the faint tang of dew from outside but doing little to dispel the room's ever-present stench of sweat, smoke, and unwashed skin. The women rose, one by one, their movements slow and deliberate, as if to delay the inevitable return to their tasks. The act of waking was itself a labor, a physical and mental effort to pull themselves from the fragile refuge of sleep. The straw beneath them was damp, its fibers clinging to their dresses, leaving faint imprints on their skin. They brushed it away with tired hands, their fingers catching on the coarse fabric of their shifts, already stiff with the grime of yesterday. Some sat for a moment, their knees drawn up, their eyes fixed on the faint light filtering into the room, as if willing it to bring something other than another day like the last. Others moved quickly, driven by habit or fear of the keeper's voice, folding their dresses, smoothing the straw, checking the small sacks of herbs or scraps of cloth they kept hidden. The floor was cold against their bare feet, its surface gritty with dirt and debris, but they stepped carefully, knowing where the worst stains lay, where the straw was slick with spilled wine or worse. The basin in the corner, still cloudy from the previous day, waited like a silent judge, a reminder of the washing that would soon begin again. The first task of the day was often to prepare the body, not for themselves but for the clients who would soon arrive. The women gathered around the basin, their hands dipping into the tepid water, their rags torn, frayed, and never truly clean, moving over their faces, necks, and groins. The water was colder now, its surface slick with an oily sheen, but they scrubbed anyway, wincing as it stung raw skin or seeped into unhealed cuts. The vinegar jug, if it had been refilled, sat nearby, its sharp scent cutting through the morning air. They dabbed it onto their skin, their movements quick and practiced, knowing that the keeper would check, that a client might complain, that a moment's neglect could cost them a meal or a coin. The act was mechanical, a ritual performed not for cleanliness but for survival, a way to meet the expectations of a world that saw them only as bodies to be used. Yet, even in this routine, there was a quiet defiance, a refusal to let the brothel fully claim them. A woman might pause, her rag dripping, and press it to her forehead, stealing a moment of coolness before the day's heat began. The brothel keeper was the first to stir, their voice a harsh note in the dawn's quiet, barking orders to prepare the room, to light a new candle, to sweep the worst of the straw's debris into a corner. The women moved quickly under the scrutiny, their hands trembling not from cold but from the weight of expectation. The keeper's eyes were sharp, missing nothing: a stain on a dress, a tangle in a woman's hair, a moment's hesitation that could be read as defiance. Punishment was swift, a slap or a withheld meal, but the women had learned to hide their exhaustion, to mask their pain with blank faces and steady hands. They swept the floor with makeshift brooms, bundles of straw tied with string or cleared the bucket, its contents sloshing as they carried it to the street, their noses wrinkled against the smell. These tasks were not about cleanliness but about maintaining the illusion of order, a pretense that the brothel was something other than a crucible of filth and labor. The dawn also brought the first clients, men who preferred the early hours, their steps heavy on the cobblestones outside, their voices loud with the confidence of those who paid. The women prepared for them, their hands moving faster now, wiping their bodies, smoothing their hair, rubbing mint leaves against their teeth to dull the morning's bitterness. The combs, those precious splintered tools, were passed around, each woman taking her turn to drag it through tangled strands, wincing as it caught on knots or pulled at the scalp. The herbs, hoarded from the previous day, were crushed and rubbed into skin or hair, their faint scent a fleeting shield against the room's stench. These acts were not for the women but for the men, a performance to meet the demands of those who saw cleanliness as a commodity, not a right. Yet, in the act of preparing, the women found small moments of rebellion: a shared glance, a whispered word, a touch of a hand that said they were more than the labor they performed. The cycle of labor began anew, as relentless as the dawn itself. The women moved from washing to working, their bodies bending to the demands of clients, their minds retreating to a place where the brothel could not fully reach. The straw crunched underfoot, the air grew heavier with each passing hour. The candle newly lit burned steadily, marking the hours until it, too, would sputter out. The men came and went, their faces a blur, their demands a constant hum in the background. The women washed between each one, their rags dipping into the basin, their hands stinging from vinegar, their skin raw from the repetition. The keeper watched, their voice cutting through the room, ensuring that no one paused too long, that no one forgot their place. The cycle was unyielding, a rhythm that shaped their days and nights, a chain that bound them to the brothel's walls. Yet the night's silence had tempered their spirits, giving them a strength that carried them through the dawn. In the quiet of those final hours, they had faced the darkness, both within and without, and emerged with a resilience that was as stubborn as the stains on the floor. They shared small acts of care: a sip of water passed from one to another, a rag shared to wipe a companion's brow, a whispered story of a life before the brothel. These acts were fleeting, often interrupted by the keeper's shout or a client's arrival, but they were enough to keep going, enough to face another day. The women moved through their tasks with a quiet determination, their hands steady even as their hearts ached, their faces blank even as their minds held on to memories of fields, rivers, and faces long gone. The dawn was a test, a moment when the women had to gather themselves, to steel their spirits for the labor ahead. They did so not with hope but with endurance, not with dreams but with the stubborn will to survive. The light that crept into the room was not a promise of better days but a reminder of the work that waited, the rags that needed dipping, the clients who had come. Yet, in that light, the women found something: a shared glance, a moment of stillness, a breath that was theirs alone. They faced the cycle of labor with bodies worn but unbroken, with spirits tempered by the night's silence, with a resilience that was their greatest rebellion. The brothel could take their time, their strength, their dignity, but it could not take their will to endure, to persist, to live. As we linger in this world, let its weight settle over you, a heavy but soothing, the blanket that draws you toward sleep. Picture the dim room, the faint gray of dawn creeping through the cracks, the soft rustle of straw as a woman rises to face the day. Hear the drip of water from a rag, the low murmur of a shared word, the creak of a door as the world stirs. Feel the air, thick with the promise of labor and the echo of resilience, pressing against your skin, and let it lull you. A reminder that even in the harshest places, life persists, stubborn and unyielding. Next, we'll explore the rare moments of connection, the bonds formed between the women that sustained them through the brothel's grind, and how these ties became their greatest strength. For now, rest in the rhythm of their world, let it carry you gently into sleep, and we'll continue the journey when you're ready. We explored the dawn, the beginning of a new day, where the women rose from the night's silence to face the relentless cycle of labor, their spirits tempered by moments of stillness and resilience. Tonight we delve deeper into their world, into the rare moments of connection, the bonds formed between the women that sustained them through the brothel's grind, and how these ties became their greatest strength. These connections, forged in whispers, glances, and shared acts of care, were a quiet rebellion against the isolation of their lives, a lifeline that held them together in a place that sought to tear them apart. Picture the dim room, the faint glow of a candle, the soft rustle of straw, and let the rhythm of their story carry you gently into sleep. If you're finding solace in these tales, please like this video and subscribe. And now, let's step back into that forgotten world, where every bond was a treasure, and every moment a testament to resilience. In the medieval brothel, where the air was thick with the stench of sweat and smoke, and the days blurred into a relentless cycle of labor, the women found strength not in solitude but in each other. The brothel was designed to isolate, to reduce them to bodies for hire, their individualities erased by the demands of clients and the keeper's sharp commands. Yet, in the cracks of this oppressive world, the women wove bonds that were as vital as the air they breathed, as precious as the rare sprigs of herbs they hoarded. These connections were not loud or grand. They were woven in the quiet moments between clients, in the flicker of a candle's light, in the shared silence of a darkened room. They were built on small acts of care, on whispered words, on the brush of a hand against a shoulder, each gesture a defiance of the brothel's attempt to strip them of their humanity. The bonds began with necessity, born in the shared struggle of survival. A new girl, her eyes wide with the shock of the brothel's reality, might falter, her hands trembling as she dipped a rag into the cloudy basin. An older woman, her face lined with the weight of years in the trade, would step close, her voice low, guiding her through the motions. Like this, she might whisper, her fingers steadying the rag, showing her how to press lightly to avoid the sting of raw skin. The gesture was small, but it was everything, a moment of kindness in a place that offered none. A bridge between two souls who understood the same pain. The new girl would nod, her shoulders easing slightly, and in that moment, a bond was formed. A thread of trust that would grow stronger with each shared glance, each quiet word. These connections were often wordless, built on the language of touch and presence. In the early morning, when the dawn's gray light crept through the cracks, the women might sit together, their knees brushing as they shared a crust of bread or a sip of sour wine. The act of sharing was a ritual, a way to affirm that they were not alone, that their hunger, their exhaustion, their fear was seen by someone else. One woman might tear the bread carefully, her cracked fingers breaking it into equal pieces, her eyes meeting her companion's with a nod that spoke of understanding. Another might pass a rag, still damp from the basin, offering it to wipe a friend's brow, the touch gentle in a way the brothel rarely allowed. These acts were not just about survival but about solidarity, a refusal to let the brothel's grind erase their capacity to care. The women shared more than food or rags. They shared stories, fragments of lives left behind. In the rare pauses between clients, when the keeper was distracted or the room was quiet, they whispered memories of villages, of families, of moments before the brothel claimed them. One might speak of a river where she swam as a child, the water cool and clear, her laughter echoing across the banks. Another might recall a market, the smell of fresh bread and herbs, the bustle of voices that felt like home. These stories were not always happy. Many carried the weight of loss, of choices forced upon them, of paths that led to the brothel's door but they were theirs, a way to anchor themselves in a world that sought to untether them. The act of telling was a rebellion, a claim to a self that the brothel could not fully erase, and the act of listening was a gift, a way to hold space for each other's humanity. The bonds were also forged in shared labor, in the small acts of care that punctuated their days. A woman might braid another's hair, her fingers moving slowly through tangled strands, not to tame them but to offer a moment of gentleness. The act was painful, the scalp tender from lice or neglect, but it was also intimate, a connection that transcended the brothel's demands. Another might clean a companion's cut, using a rag dipped in vinegar, her touch careful to avoid causing more pain. These acts were not about hygiene but about presence, about reminding each other that they were more than the work they did. They shared herbs, passing a sprig of rosemary or mint, crushing it between their fingers to release its scent, a fleeting shield against the room's stench. These moments were fragile, easily broken by a client's arrival or the keeper's shout, but they were enough to sustain them, enough to face another day. The women also found strength in shared defiance. In the small ways they resisted the brothel's control. They might hide a comb or a sack of herbs, tucking it into the straw or the folds of their dress, a secret kept from the keeper's prying eyes. They might whisper a joke, their voices low, their laughter stifled to avoid detection, a spark of joy that the brothel could not snuff out. Some sang softly, their voices barely audible, old songs from villages or churches, their melodies a thread of memory that wove them together. These acts were dangerous. Laughter could draw a slap, a hidden herb could mean a night without food, but they were worth it, because they were a reminder that the brothel did not own them entirely, that they could still find moments of freedom in each other's company. The bonds were not without their tensions. The brothel was a place of scarcity, where a crust of bread, a sip of wine, or a moment's rest was a prize to be fought for. Jealousy could flare, sharp and sudden, when one woman received a client's favor or a keeper's leniency. Words could turn bitter, whispered accusations, cutting deeper than the sting of vinegar on raw skin. Yet, these moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the need to survive together. A woman who snapped in anger might later offer a rag, her eyes averted, her gesture an unspoken apology. Another might share a story, her voice soft, drawing her companion back into the fold. The bonds were tested, but they held, because the women knew that their strength lay in each other, that alone they might break, but together they could endure. These connections were their greatest strength, a lifeline that sustained them through the brothel's grind. When a woman faltered, her body shaking from exhaustion or her spirit heavy with despair, another would be there, her hand steady, her presence a reminder that they were not alone. When the keeper's voice grew sharp or a client's demands grew cruel, they found solace in a shared glance, a touch that said they understood. The brothel could take their time, their bodies, their dignity, but it could not take their bonds, the quiet, stubborn ties that held them together. They were sisters, not by blood but by circumstance, their lives woven together in the dim light of the brothel, their strength drawn from the moments they shared, however small, however fleeting. In our last journey, we explored the bonds formed between the women, the quiet acts of care and solidarity that wove them together, becoming their greatest strength against the brothel's relentless grind. Tonight, we delve deeper into the world, into the rare moments of hope, the fleeting dreams that flickered in their hearts, and how these sparks sustained them through the darkest days. These moments, fragile as a candle's flame, were not promises of escape but embers of resilience, glowing in the face of despair. Picture the dim room, the faint glow of a candle, the soft rustle of straw, and let the rhythm of their story carry you gently into sleep. If you're finding solace in these tales, please like this video and subscribe. And now, let's step back into that forgotten world, where every spark of hope was a rebellion, and every moment a testament to endurance. In the medieval brothel, where the air was thick with the stench of sweat, smoke, and unwashed skin, and the days merged into an unending cycle of labor, hope was not a constant presence but a rare visitor, a fleeting guest that arrived unbidden and left too soon. The women lived in a world that sought to crush their spirits, reducing them to bodies for hire, their lives measured in coins and clients. Yet, in the quiet corners of their hearts, in the spaces between washing, working, and waiting, they nurtured dreams, small, fragile, often unspoken, that flickered like stars in a clouded sky. These dreams were not grand visions of freedom or wealth. They were simpler, more human, a memory of a kinder time, a hope for a softer touch, a wish for a day without pain. These sparks of hope, however faint, were what kept them moving, what gave them the strength to face another dawn, another client, another dip of the rag into the cloudy basin. Hope often came in the form of memories, vivid flashes of lives before the brothel's walls closed in. A woman might sit in the dim light of the early morning, her hands still from the night's labor, and recall a meadow where she ran as a child, the grass cool beneath her feet, the air sweet with wildflowers. She would close her eyes, her breath slowing, and let the memory wash over her, the colors bright against the gray of the brothel's stone walls. Another might think of a mother's voice, soft and steady, singing a lullaby as she braided her hair, or a father's rough hand guiding her through a market, the stalls alive with the scent of bread and spices. These memories were not just escapes but anchors, reminders of a self that still existed beneath the weight of the brothel's demands. They were private, rarely shared, but when they were offered like gifts, a whispered story, the dark, a quiet confession between two women as they sat shoulder to shoulder, their knees brushing in the straw. The act of holding on to hope was a rebellion in itself, a refusal to let the brothel define them entirely. The women knew the odds against them, knew that escape was unlikely, that their lives were bound to the cycle of labor, but they clung to their dreams with a stubbornness that defied the keeper's sharp voice or the client's careless hands. One woman might dream of a day when she could buy her freedom, her fingers counting the coins she hid in a crack in the wall, each one a step toward a life beyond the brothel. Another might hope for a kind client, one who would look at her with something other than desire, who might leave a small gift, a ribbon, a comb, a moment of respect. These dreams were small, almost trivial in their simplicity, but they were powerful, fueling the women's endurance, giving them a reason to rise each morning, to dip their rags into the basin, to face the day's grind. Hope also flickered in the small acts of care they performed for themselves and each other, acts that were as much about defiance as survival. A woman might save a sprig of mint, tucking it into the folds of her dress, and later press it to her lips, the sharp taste a reminder of something clean, something alive. She might share it with a companion, their fingers brushing as they passed, the leaf, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. Another might mend her dress in the early dawn, her needle moving slowly through the frayed fabric, each stitch a quiet assertion that she was more than the brothel's filth, that she could still create something whole. These acts were not solutions but symbols, proof that the women could still choose, still dream, still hope, even in a place that sought to strip them of all three. The women also found hope in the world outside the brothel, however distant it seemed, in the rare moments when they stepped outside to fetch water, to dump the bucket, to gather herbs. They caught glimpses of a life beyond the stone walls. The street was alive with sounds, the clatter of carts, the shouts of vendors, the laughter of children running through the mud. A woman might pause, her bucket heavy in her hands, and watch a bird wheel across the sky, its wings a fleeting promise of freedom. She might hear a church bell tolling in the distance, its sound carrying memories of Sundays spent in prayer, of a time when her life was more than labor. These glimpses were brief, often interrupted by the keeper's call or a client's arrival, but they were enough to spark a dream, to plant a seed of hope that one day, somehow, she might walk those streets as something other than a prostitute. The brothel keeper, with their sharp eyes and sharper tongues, sought to snuff out these sparks, knowing that hope could breed defiance, that a woman who dreamed might dare to resist. Work, they'd snap, their voice cutting through the dawn's quiet, pulling the women back to the basin, the rag, the straw. But the women had learned to hide their dreams, to keep them tucked away in the corners of their hearts, safe from scrutiny. They might share a glance, a faint smile, a nod that said they understood, that their hopes were shared, even if unspoken. These moments of connection were a lifeline, a reminder that they were not alone, that their dreams, however small, were valid, were real. A woman might whisper a plan to another, saving a coin, finding a way to leave, dreaming of a village where no one knew her past, and the act of speaking it, however quietly, made it feel possible, if only for a moment. The darkness of the brothel's nights, the silence that followed the candle's last flicker, was often where hope took root. In those quiet hours, when the room was still and the keeper slept, the women could let their thoughts wander, could allow themselves to dream without fear of interruption. One might lie in the straw, her hands folded over her chest, and imagine a cottage with a garden, the earth soft beneath her fingers as she planted seeds. Another might dream of a child, her own or one she'd left behind, grown and strong, waiting for her somewhere beyond the city's walls. These dreams were fragile, easily shattered by the dawn's light or the keeper's voice, but they were enough to carry them through, enough to give them the strength to face another day of washing, working, waiting. The act of hoping was not without its pain. To dream in the brothel was to confront the gap between what was and what might be, to feel the weight of a life that seemed out of reach. A woman might wake from a dream of freedom, her heart racing, only to find the same stone walls, the same damp straw, the same cloudy basin waiting for her. The ache of that realization was sharp, a wound that never fully healed, but it was also a reminder of her resilience, of her ability to hold on to hope despite the brothel's grind. She might share that ache with another, their voices low in the dark, their words a confession of both pain and strength. I dreamed of the sea, one might say, her voice barely audible, and the other would nod, her hand resting on her companion's arm, a silent acknowledgement that the dream mattered, that it was enough. Hope was also a shared act, a flame passed from one woman to another. When one faltered, her eyes dull with exhaustion or despair, another would be there, offering a word, a touch, a story that reminded her of what could be. They might share a memory of a festival, the music and laughter filling the air, or a tale of a woman who had left the brothel, her fate uncertain but her departure a spark of possibility. These stories, whether true or imagined, were a currency of hope, traded in whispers, cherished in silence. They were a reminder that the brothel was not the end, that there was a world beyond its walls, even if they could not yet reach it. The women clung to these sparks, their hands steady as they dipped their rags, their hearts stubborn as they faced another client, another day. That cycle of labor continued, relentless and unyielding, but the women's hopes gave them a strength that the brothel could not break. They washed their bodies, not just for the clients but for themselves, a small act of care that said they were worth more than the coins they earned. They shared their dreams, not because they believed they would come true, but because the act of dreaming was a rebellion, a refusal to let the brothel define them. They faced the dawn, the clients, the keeper, with spirits tempered by the night's silence and the bonds they had forged, their hopes a quiet fire that burned within them, lighting the way through the darkest days. The medieval brothel was a world unto itself, a suffocating enclosure of stone walls, damp straw, and stagnant air, where the women's lives were bound to the relentless cycle of washing, working, and waiting. Yet, there were fleeting and fiercely cherished when the women stepped beyond those walls, into the streets of the medieval city, where the air was not yet tainted by the brothel's stench, and the world felt for a moment alive with possibility. These encounters were not escapes, they were necessities, driven by the demands of survival to fetch water, to dump the bucket, to barter for herbs or scraps of cloth. But in these brief forays, the women glimpsed a world that was both cruelly distant and tantalizingly close, a world of markets, churches, and rivers that reminded them of lives they had once known or dreamed of. These moments shaped their resilience, offering a breath of hope, a spark of defiance, that they carried back into the brothel's gloom. The act of stepping outside was itself a ritual, one fraught with both risk and reward. The brothel keeper rarely allowed the women to leave without purpose, their sharp eyes watching for any sign of lingering or defiance. "Hurry," they'd bark, as a woman hefted a wooden bucket, its weight pulling at her sore arms, or carried a bundle of rags, to the river. The door creaked open, its rusted hinges groaning, and the woman stepped into the street, her bare feet meeting the cold, uneven cobblestones. The air outside was a shock, sharp with the tang of wood smoke, horse dung, and the faint sweetness of dew, a stark contrast to the brothel's heavy miasma. She would pause, just for a moment, her eyes lifting to the sky, gray with dawn or streaked with the colors of dusk, and breathe deeply, letting the freshness fill her lungs, if only for a second. The street was alive with sounds, the clatter of carts, the shouts of vendors, the laughter of children running through the mud, and these sounds, so different from the brothel's muffled groans, were a reminder of a world that still turned, a world that existed beyond her labor. Fetching water was one of the most common reasons to leave the brothel, a task often assigned to the newest or youngest woman, her arms still strong enough to carry the heavy bucket from the well or river. The journey was short, sometimes just a few streets away, but it was a pilgrimage of sorts, a chance to feel the ground beneath her feet, to see faces that did not demand her body. The well was a gathering place, where washerwomen and servants exchanged gossip, their voices a low hum against the splash of water. The woman from the brothel would stand at the edge, her bucket in hand, her eyes downcast to avoid their stares. Some would whisper, their words sharp with judgment, but others might nod, a small gesture of recognition that she, too, was part of the city's rhythm. She would dip her bucket into the well, the water cold against her hands, its surface rippling, with the promise of something clean, something untouched. but by the time she carried it back, the water was already tainted, specked with dust from the street or mud from the bucket's cracked interior. A reminder that even this small act of fetching was bound to the brothel's reality. The river was another destination, a place where the women might rinse their rags or wash their dresses, though the water was rarely cleaner than the basin they left behind. The riverbank was slick with mud, its surface dotted with refuse from the city fish bones, vegetable peels, the occasional dead rat. The women knelt, their knees sinking into the cold earth, their hands numb as they scrubbed the rags against rocks or their own knuckles. The water was murky, carrying the city's waste, but it was better than the basin's oily sheen, and they worked quickly, knowing the keeper would count the minutes they were gone. Sometimes, another woman would join them, a companion from the brothel, and they would work side by side, their movements synchronized, their silence a shared language. A glance, a faint smile, a brush of hands as they passed a rag. These were moments of connection, fleeting but vital, that carried them back to the brothel with a renewed sense of purpose. These encounters with the outside world were not just about tasks but about human connection, however brief. At the market, where a woman might barter a coin or a favor for a sprig of rosemary or a scrap of cloth, she would meet the eyes of a merchant, his hands rough from years of trade, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Take it," he might say, tossing her an extra leaf, his gestures small but heavy with meaning. She would tuck the herb into her dress, its scent a faint shield against the brothel's stench, and carry his kindness back with her, a spark that warmed her through the day's labor. In the church, where some women slipped in during the quiet hours, they might kneel in the shadows, their heads bowed, their lips moving in silent prayer. The priest might see her, his eyes softening for a moment, offering a nod or a murmured blessing that felt like a lifeline. These encounters were rare, often stolen, but they were enough to remind the women that they were part of something larger, that their lives, however marginalized, still touched the world. The outside world was not always kind. The streets could be cruel, filled with leering men, judgmental whispers, or the sharp sting of a thrown stone. A woman might walk with her head down, her shoulders hunched, trying to make herself small against the weight of the city's gaze. Yet, even these moments shaped her resilience, teaching her to move quickly, to read the crowd, to find the paths where she could pass unseen. The insults stung, but they also hardened her, reinforcing the stubborn will that kept her going. She learned to listen for the kind of voices: the washerwoman who shared a laugh, the child who smiled without knowing her trade, the beggar who offered a nod of shared struggle. These interactions, however small, were threads in the fabric of her survival, weaving a tapestry of resilience that she carried back to the brothel's dim rooms. Returning to the brothel was always a jolt, a descent back into the heavy air, the flickering candlelight, the crunch of straw underfoot. The women brought with them the sense of the outside world: dew, mud, the faint trace of herbs, but these faded quickly, swallowed by the room's relentless stench. Yet, they also brought something intangible, a spark of hope, a memory of a kind of face, a moment of freedom that lingered in their hearts. They would share these encounters with their companions, their voices low in the dark, describing the market's colors, the river's flow, the church's quiet. These stories were a currency of hope, a way to keep the outside world alive within the brothel's walls, a reminder that they were not entirely cut off from the life beyond. These fleeting encounters shaped the women's resilience, giving them a reason to endure the cycle of labor that awaited them. They dipped their rags into the basin, their hands stinging from the cold water, their minds holding on to the memory of a bird's flight or a merchant's kindness. They scrubbed the skin with vinegar, wincing at the burn, but carried the echo of a church bell in their hearts. They faced the clients, the keeper, the endless tasks, with a strength drawn from these moments outside, a strength that said they were more than the brothel's demands. The encounters were brief, but they were enough to sustain them, enough to fuel the quiet rebellion that burned within them, a refusal to let the brothel claim their entire existence. The medieval brothel was a world of chaos, a relentless churn of bodies, demands, and filth, where the air hung heavy with the stench of sweat, smoke, and unwashed skin, and the days blurred into an unending cycle of labor. Yet, within this chaos, the women crafted rituals of survival, daily routines that became their armor, grounding them against the tide of despair that threatened to sweep them away. These rituals were not grand or heroic. They were small, repetitive acts: wiping a rag across their skin, combing tangled hair, sharing a sprig of mint that wove order into the disorder of their lives. Each act, however mundane, was a quiet assertion of their existence, a way to hold themselves together when the world seemed intent on tearing them apart. The basin, the straw, the flickering candle, these were the tools of their survival, wielded with a stubborn resilience that spoke to their refusal to be consumed by the brothel's grind. The day began with the basin, a shallow pitted vessel that sat in the corner like a grim sentinel, its water cloudy with the residue of countless hands. The women gathered around it as the first gray light of dawn crept through the cracks in the walls, their bare feet cold against the stone floor, their hands reaching for the rags that were never truly clean. The act of washing was their first ritual, a mechanical task performed not for cleanliness but for survival. They dipped the rags into the tepid water, its surface slick with an oily sheen, and scrubbed their faces, necks, and groins, wincing as the liquid stung raw skin or seeped into unhealed cuts. The water was shared by all, a communal burden that carried the dirt of every woman, every client, every night. Some added a splash of vinegar from a jug nearby, its sharp bite burning against sores, its scent cutting through the room's heavy air like a blade. The act was painful, the rags rough, the water cold, but it was a ritual they clung to, a way to mark the start of the day, to assert some control over bodies that were otherwise not their own. The rags themselves were a cornerstone of their routines, torn from old dresses or blankets, their fibers stiff with the weight of use. To hold one was to feel the history of the brothel, a tactile reminder of the countless hands that had gripped it, the countless lives that had depended on it. The women handled them with care, knowing they were finite, knowing that a frayed rag meant sacrificing another piece of their dress or stealing a moment to tear a new strip from a discarded cloth. Some rinsed them in the river when they could, slipping out before dawn, their hands numb as they scrubbed against rocks, the water murky with the city's waste. But the rags never stayed clean for long, absorbing the basin's grime, the straw's dampness, the skin's sweat. Yet, the act of using them, of folding them carefully after each wipe, was a ritual of survival, a small act of order in a world that offered none. A woman might pause her rag dripping and press it to her forehead, stealing a moment of coolness before the day's heat began, a quiet rebellion against the chaos that surrounded her. Combing their hair was another ritual, a painful but necessary act that grounded them in the face of the brothel's disorder. The combs were crude, carved from bone or wood, their teeth uneven and splintered, prone to snapping if pressed too hard. They were shared among the women, passed from hand to hand in the dim light, each stroke a battle against tangles and lice. The act was slow, deliberate, the scalp tender from days of neglect, the hair matted with sweat and grime. A woman might sit cross-legged on the straw, her companion behind her, the comb scraping through knots, each tug pulling a wince or a sharp breath. The pain was a constant, but so was the connection, the quiet rhythm of one woman caring for another, their hands steady despite the ache. When no comb was available, they used their fingers, raking through strands with cracked nails, pulling out lice with a grim determination that spoke of their endurance. This ritual was not about beauty but about survival, a way to fight the chaos of their bodies, to impose a semblance of order on a world that sought to unravel them. The herbs were a sacred part of their routines, a fragile thread of beauty in a place that thrived on ugliness. Rosemary, thyme, and mint were the most common, gathered from the edges of the city or bartered from a merchant for a coin or a favor. The women kept them in small cloth sacks, tucked into the folds of their dresses or hidden beneath the straw, guarding them like treasures. To use them was to invite a moment of relief, a fleeting scent that cut through the room's heavy air. They crushed the leaves between their fingers, rubbing them into their scalps or skin, or burned them in a clay pot, the smoke curling upward, mingling with the tallow lamp's acrid haze. The act was deliberate, a ritual that required care, which leaf to use, deciding when to burn it, sharing it with a companion. A woman might press a sprig of mint to her lips, inhaling deeply, the sharpness a reminder of something alive, something clean. Another might wave the smoke over her bedding, hoping to mask the straw's damp stench, even for a moment. These rituals were small, but they were profound, a way to reclaim their senses, to assert that they could still create beauty, even in a place that sought to crush it. Meals were another ritual, a necessity woven into the fabric of their survival. Food was scarce, often just a crust of stale bread or a bowl of watery stew, eaten with hands that had just wiped bodies or swept straw. The women sat in a circle, their knees brushing, their eyes fixed on the meager portions they shared. The act of eating was mechanical, driven by hunger rather than pleasure, but it was also a ritual of connection, a moment to pause, to look at each other, to share a nod or a glance. A woman might break her bread in half, offering a piece to a companion, her gesture a quiet defiance of the brothel's scarcity. Another might sip from a shared cup of sour wine, its taste bitter but grounding, a reminder that they could still taste, still feel, still live. The act of eating together, however brief, was a ritual that anchored them, a way to mark the passage of the day, to find strength in the presence of others. The bucket in the corner was a grim necessity, its own ritual of survival, tucked behind a tattered curtain, if one existed. It was always full by morning, its contents sloshing dangerously close to the rim, the smell sharp and sour, mingling with the room's other odors. Emptying it was a task no one wanted, but it was part of the routine, a shared burden that rotated among the women. The one chosen would carry it to the street, her arms straining under the weight, her nose wrinkled against the stench. She would dump it in the gutter, the liquid splashing against the cobblestones, and rinse the bucket with a splash of river water, knowing it would never be clean. The act was humiliating, but it was also grounding, a reminder of their shared struggle, their shared survival. Back in the brothel, she would set the bucket in its place, her hands trembling from the effort, her companions offering a nod or a touch, a silent acknowledgement of the task's weight. These rituals were not just about survival but about resistance, a way to impose order on the chaos of the brothel. The women moved through them with a steady rhythm, their hands dipping rags, combing hair, crushing herbs, breaking bread, emptying buckets. Each act was a small rebellion, a refusal to let the brothel's disorder consume them. They faced the clients, the keeper, the endless tasks, with bodies worn but unbroken, their routines a kind of armor that protected their spirits. The basin, the rags, the combs, the herbs, the bread, the bucket, these were the tools of their survival, wielded with a quiet determination that spoke to their resilience. They lived in the chaos, breathed it, wore it, and yet they persisted, their days marked by the rhythm of repetition, their lives grounded by the rituals that held them together. The medieval brothel was a crucible of control, its stone walls and heavy air designed to strip the women of their agency, reducing them to bodies bound by the relentless demands of clients and the brothel keeper's sharp commands. The stench of sweat, smoke, and unwashed skin clung to every surface, a constant reminder of their confinement, while the cycle of washing, working, and waiting ground their days into a blur of exhaustion. Yet, within this oppressive world, the women carved out moments of resistance, subtle and overt acts of defiance that challenged the brothel's hold over them. These acts, hiding a coin, sharing a forbidden laugh, stealing a moment to gaze at the sky, were not grand rebellions but quiet, stubborn assertions of their humanity. Each act, however small, shaped their sense of self, reinforcing their resilience, reminding them that they were more than the labor they performed, more than the filth they endured. The basin, the rags, the combs, the straw, these were not just tools of survival but weapons of defiance, wielded with a determination that spoke to their unyielding spirit. Resistance began in the smallest gestures, the ones the keeper's sharp eyes might miss. A woman might linger a moment longer at the basin, her rag dripping, her hands moving slowly as she wiped her face, not for the clients but for herself, savoring the coolness against her skin. The act was deliberate, a refusal to rush, a claim to a moment that was hers alone. She might dip her fingers into the water, letting them linger in the cloudy liquid, tracing circles that no one else could see, a private rebellion against the brothel's demand for speed. The water was never clean, its surface slick with the residue of countless hands, but in that moment, it was hers, a small piece of the world she could control. Another woman might pause before a client, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of defiance, a look that said she saw him, not as a master but as a man, flawed and fleeting. These glances were dangerous, risking a slap or a withheld meal, but they were worth it, a spark of agency that burned in her chest, reminding her that she was not entirely owned. The combs, those crude splintered tools, were another side of resistance, shared among the women, their teeth worn and uneven. They were more than instruments for grooming, they were symbols of defiance. A woman might hide a comb in the folds of her dress, tucking it away from the keeper's prying eyes, knowing that to be caught could mean punishment. She would use it in secret, late at night when the candle burned low, combing her hair with slow, careful strokes, not to please a client but to reclaim her body. The act was painful, the scalp tender from lice and neglect, but it was also empowering, a way to assert that her body was more than a commodity. She might share the comb with a companion, their hands brushing as they passed it, their silence a shared understanding. The act of sharing was itself a rebellion, a refusal to let the brothel's scarcity divide them, a way to weave their fates together in the face of isolation. Herbs were another weapon, their faint scents a quiet revolt against the brothel's stench. Rosemary, thyme, and mint, gathered from the city's edges or bartered with a merchant, were hoarded like treasures, hidden in small cloth sacks beneath the straw or sewn into a dress's hem. The women used them sparingly, knowing they were finite, knowing that to be caught with them could mean a beating. A woman might crush a leaf between her fingers, rubbing it into her scalp or wrists, the sharp scent cutting through the room's heavy air, a fleeting reminder of a world beyond the walls. She might burn a sprig in a clay pot, waving the smoke over her bedding, not to mask the stench but to create something beautiful, something hers. The act was dangerous, the smoke drawing attention, but it was worth it for the moment of control, the moment when the air was hers to shape. She might share a leaf with another, their fingers touching as they passed it, their eyes meeting in a silent pact. This sharing was a defiance of the keeper's rules, a way to say that they could still give, still connect, still resist. Laughter was a rarer but more powerful act of resistance, a sound that the brothel sought to silence. The keeper's voice was quick to cut through any hint of joy, barking orders to work, to move, to serve. Yet, in the quiet moments between clients, in the early dawn, or late at night when the candle flickered low, women found ways to laugh. It might start with a whispered joke, a mimicry of a client's pompous strut, or the keeper's sharp tone, shared in the shadows where no one else could hear. The laughter was soft, stifled to avoid detection, but it was a rebellion, a spark that lit up the gloom. A woman might cover her mouth, her shoulders shaking, her eyes bright with a joy that the brothel could not extinguish. Another might join in, their laughter mingling, a fragile thread that bound them together. These moments were fleeting, easily shattered by a creak of the door or a shout from the keeper, but they were enough to remind them that they could still feel, still find joy, still resist the weight of their lives. Hiding coins was another act of defiance, a secret rebellion that carried the weight of hope. The women earned little, their coins often claimed by the keeper for rent, food, or debts that never seemed to shrink. Yet, some found ways to keep a coin or two, tucking them into a crack in the wall, a fold in the straw, or a seam in their dress. The act was dangerous, the keeper's eyes sharp, their hands quick to search. A woman might sit in the dark, her fingers tracing the edge of a coin, its metal cool against her skin, a tangible dream of freedom. She might share her secret with a trusted companion, their whispers low, their plans fragile but fierce. A coin saved today might buy a loaf tomorrow, or a passage out of the city someday. The act of hiding was a rebellion against the brothel's claim on their earnings, a refusal to let every piece of their labor be taken. It was a small act, but it was theirs, a spark of agency that burned in their hearts. The women also resisted, through their stories, whispered in the dark when the keeper slept and the clients were gone. These were not just tales of villages or families left behind, but acts of defiance, a way to claim their pasts, their identities, in a place that sought to erase them. A woman might speak of a river where she swam, its water cool and clear, her voice soft but steady, painting the scene with words that brought it to life. Another might tell of a festival, the music and laughter filling the air, her hands moving as if to trace the dance she once knew. These stories were dangerous, risking the keeper's wrath if overheard, but they were worth it for the way they grounded the women, reminding them of who they were before the brothel. The act of listening was as much a rebellion as the telling, a way to honor each other's humanity, to keep their spirits alive in the face of chaos. Physical resistance was rarer, but it happened small, subtle acts that carried great risk. A woman might move slowly when the keeper barked an order, her steps deliberate, her hands lingering on a rag or a comb, claiming a moment of her own time. Another might refuse a client's demand, her voice low but firm, her eyes steady, knowing the cost could be a blow or a night without food. These acts were not common, for survival often meant compliance, but when they happened, they were a fire, a blaze that lit up the brothel's gloom. The other women would watch, their breaths held, their hearts swelling with a mix of fear and pride. A single act of defiance could ripple through the room, a reminder that they were not entirely broken, that they could still choose, still resist. These moments of resistance were not without cost. The keeper's punishments were swift: a slap, a withheld meal, a night locked in a cold corner of the brothel. The clients could be crueler, their complaints leading to harsher beatings or worse. Yet, the women persisted, their acts of defiance, a kind of armor, protecting their sense of self against the brothel's relentless control. They hid coins, shared laughter, whispered stories, moved slowly, knowing the risks but choosing to act anyway. Each act was a thread in the tapestry of their resilience, a way to weave their identities into a world that sought to unravel them. The basin, the rags, the combs, the herbs, the stories, these were their weapons, wielded with a quiet strength that spoke to their refusal to be fully owned. The brothel's rhythm was unyielding, a cycle of labor that left little room for anything else. But in these acts of resistance, the women created their own rhythm, a softer, steadier beat that carried them through the chaos. The candle burned low, its wax pooling on the floor, marking the passage of another night. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of straw, smoke, and herbs. But in these moments, it seemed to lighten, to offer a breath of something freer. The women resisted, not because they believed they could escape, but because they believed in themselves, in their right to exist beyond the brothel's demands. They faced the chaos with bodies worn but unbroken, with spirits tempered by their small rebellions, with a resilience that was their greatest defiance. The medieval brothel was a world of relentless demands, its stone walls and heavy air, a constant assault on the body and spirit, where the stench of sweat, smoke, and unwashed skin clung to every surface, and the cycle of washing, working, and waiting ground the women's days into a haze of exhaustion. Yet, beneath the surface of their labor, beneath the rituals of survival and the acts of resistance, the women carried silent burdens, unspoken griefs and traumas that weighed on their hearts like stones. These burdens were not visible to the clients who came and went, nor to the keeper whose sharp eyes missed nothing but the pain within. They were carried in the quiet moments when the candle burned low, when the straw crunched softly underfoot, when the basin's water stilled moments, when the women faced the memories of lives lost, the shame of their trade, and the fear of a future that offered no escape. These griefs, heavy and unvoiced, shaped their resilience, their survival a testament to their ability to bear the unbearable, to find ways to endure in a place that sought to break them. The weight of their burdens was felt most keenly in the stillness of the night, when the brothel fell as silent as it ever could. The clients gone, the keeper asleep, the candle's flame reduced to a flickering ember. A woman might lie on her pile of damp straw, her body curled against the cold, her hands folded over her chest as if to hold her heart together. In the dark, her thoughts would wander, unbidden, to the life she had left behind, a village where she once laughed with a sister, a mother's hands braiding her hair, a child she might never see again. The memories were sharp, cutting through the numbness of her daily labor, bringing with them a grief that was both a comfort and a wound. She might recall a moment of joy, a festival where she danced under torchlight only to feel the ache of its absence, the realization that such moments were gone, perhaps forever. The straw beneath her was damp, its fibers poking through her dress. But it was the weight of these memories that pressed hardest, a burden she carried in silence, her lips still, her eyes fixed on the darkness. The shame of their trade was another burden, one that clung to them like the brothel stench. The women knew how the world saw them: outcasts, sinners, objects of scorn or lust, their names whispered in judgment by those who passed them in the street. This shame was not just external but internal, a voice that echoed in their quiet moments, questioning their worth, their choices, their very existence. A woman might sit by the basin, her rag dripping, her hands paused as she stared into the cloudy water, seeing not her reflection but the weight of what she had become. She might remember a time when she was a daughter, a sister, a girl with dreams, and feel the sting of how far she had fallen. Yet she would dip the rag again, scrubbing her skin until it burned, not because it erased the shame but because it was something she could do, a way to move forward, to keep breathing. The act was a ritual, a way to bear the burden, to carry the shame without letting it consume her. Fear was another silent weight, a constant companion that lingered in the back of their minds. Fear of the keeper's wrath, of a client's violence, of disease that could take root in their bodies, of a future that looked no different from the present. A woman might wake in the night, her heart pounding, her breath shallow, the memory of a client's cruel hands or a keeper's sharp blow vivid in her mind. She would lie still, listening to the soft breaths of her companions, their presence a small comfort against the fear that gnawed at her. In the morning, she might hesitate before approaching the basin, knowing that each dip of the rag was a step toward another client, another risk, another moment when her body was not her own. Yet, she would wash her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart, her fear a burden she carried silently, her resilience a quiet defiance of its weight. The women bore these burdens in their daily rituals, finding ways to ground themselves in the face of grief and fear. The basin was a focal point, its cloudy water a mirror for their pain. A woman might linger over it, her rag moving slowly, her eyes fixed on the ripples as she let herself feel the weight of her memories. She might whisper a name, a child, a sister, a mother under her breath, the sound swallowed by the room's heavy air, a private act of remembrance that kept her anchored. Another might comb her hair with a splintered comb, each tug a reminder of the pain she carried, but also of her refusal to let it define her. The act was slow, painful, the scalp tender from lice and neglect, but it was hers, a way to claim her body, to hold on to herself in the face of loss. These rituals were not solutions but salves, small acts that helped them carry their burdens, that kept the grief from overwhelming them. The herbs, those precious sprigs of rosemary, thyme, or mint, were another way to bear the weight. A woman might crush a leaf between her fingers, inhaling deeply, the sharp scent cutting through the brothel's stench, a fleeting shield against the memories that pressed close. She might rub it into her wrists, her neck, her scalp, not for cleanliness but for comfort, a way to remind herself that she could still feel, still sense something beautiful. She might share the leaf with a companion, their fingers brushing, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. The act was a rebellion, a defiance of the brothel's attempt to strip them of their senses, but it was also a way to carry their grief, to let it sit alongside the scent of mint, to hold it without letting it break them. Burning the herbs in a clay pot, waving the smoke over the straw, was another ritual, the curling tendrils a fragile offering to the memories they carried, a way to honor the past without being consumed by it. The women also bore their burdens, in their silences, in the moments when words were too heavy to speak. They sat together, their knees touching, their hands folded in their laps, the straw crunching softly beneath them. The silence was not empty but full, heavy with the griefs they could not voice, the traumas they could not share. A woman might rest her hand on another's shoulder, the touch light but steady, a way to say she understood, that she carried her own burdens too. Another might hum a tune, soft and uneven, a fragment of a lullaby from a life before the brothel, the sound a bridge between her past and present. These silences were a language, a way to share the weight without breaking under it, to acknowledge the pain without letting it spill over. They were a testament to their resilience, their ability to carry the unbearable, to find strength in the quiet moments when the world was still. The physical toll of their labor was another burden, one that marked their bodies as surely as their grief marked their hearts. Their hands were cracked, their skin raw from the basin's water and the vinegar's sting, their backs aching from hours of standing, kneeling, or lying on the damp straw. A woman might rub her fingers together, wincing at the pain, but continue her tasks, her hands dipping the rag, combing her hair, crushing herbs, The pain was a constant, a reminder of the body's limits, but it was also a badge of survival, a sign that she was still here, still fighting. She might share a rag with a companion, their hands brushing as they passed it. They act a small defiance of the pain they both carried. The straw, damp and matted, was another burden, its fibers poking through their dresses, leaving red marks on their skin. Yet they lay on it each night, their bodies curled against the cold, their resilience a quiet refusal to let the physical toll break them. The brothel's rhythm was unyielding, a cycle of labor that left little room for grief or fear. But in the quiet moments, the women found ways to bear their burdens. They whispered names, crushed herbs, shared silences, their acts a kind of armor against the chaos of their lives. The candle burned low, its wax pooling on the floor, marking the passage of another night. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of straw, smoke, and unwashed skin. But in these moments it seemed to soften, to offer a breath of something gentler. The women carried their griefs and traumas, not because they chose them, but because they had to, because their survival depended on it. They faced the darkness with hearts heavy but unbroken, with spirits tempered by the weight they bore, with a resilience that was their greatest strength. The medieval brothel was a crucible of suffering, its stone walls and heavy air a constant assault on the women who lived within, their days ground down by the unyielding cycle of labor. The stench of sweat, smoke, and unwashed skin permeated every corner, a suffocating reminder of their confinement, while the rhythm of washing, working, and waiting wore at their bodies and spirits like a relentless tide. Yet within this oppressive world, the women navigated cycles of despair and renewal, an emotional ebb and flow that shaped their existence. There were moments when hopelessness crashed over them, heavy as the brothel's air, threatening to drown their will to endure. But there were also moments of renewal, small victories, a shared laugh, a kind glance, a memory reclaimed that lifted them, however briefly, from the depths. These fluctuations were not just the backdrop of their lives but the pulse of their survival, weaving despair and hope into a tapestry that defined their resilience. The basin, the rags, the combs, the straw, these were the tools of their labor, but their tears, their laughter, their stubborn persistence were the threads of their endurance, binding them to life in a place that sought to break them. Despair often came unbidden, creeping into the quiet moments when the brothel's chaos slowed. In the dim light of a flickering candle, a woman might sit on her pile of damp straw, her knees drawn up, her hands idle for the first time in hours. The weight of the day would settle over her, heavy and unyielding, her thoughts turning to the life she had lost, a village, a family, a name that was no longer hers. The straw beneath her was cold, its fibers poking through her worn dress, its dampness seeping into her skin, a reminder of the filth that surrounded her. She might press her hands to her face, her breath uneven, her chest tight with a grief that had no outlet. The air was thick, carrying the sour tang of the bucket in the corner, the acrid bite of smoke from a dying tallow lamp, and the ever-present musk of unwashed bodies. In these moments, despair was a physical presence, wrapping around her like a second skin, whispering that this was all there would ever be: another client, another rag, another night in the brothel's grip. The basin was a frequent sight of despair, its cloudy water a mirror to the women's exhaustion. A woman might stand before it, her rag dripping, her hands trembling as she scrubbed her skin, the act mechanical but heavy with futility. The water was never clean, its surface slick with the residue of countless hands, its chill biting into her cracked fingers. She might stare into it, her reflection distorted, seeing not her face but the weight of her days, the client who took without giving, the keeper who watched without mercy, the endless cycle that offered no escape. Her shoulders might slump, her breath catching as a wave of hopelessness washed over her, the rag slipping from her fingers to the floor. Another woman might notice, her own hands pausing, her eyes soft with understanding. She might step closer, picking up the rag, pressing it back into her companion's hand, a silent gesture that said, "You are not alone." This moment of connection, however small, was a spark of renewal, a reminder that despair could be shared, could be borne together. The keeper's presence was a constant source of despair, their sharp voice cutting through the room like a blade, their eyes missing nothing. A woman might falter under a barked order, her hands shaking as she swept the straw or carried the bucket, the keeper's gaze heavy with judgment. The bucket, always full by morning, its contents sloshing with a sour stench, was a particular trigger, carrying it to the streets, her arms straining, her bare feet slipping on the cobblestones. She might feel the weight of her degradation, the shame of a task that marked her as less than human. The street was no kinder, with passers-by averting their eyes or whispering judgments, their voices a reminder of her place on the margins. She might return to the brothel, her head bowed, her heart heavy with despair. The bucket's weight a metaphor for the life she carried. Yet, in the brothel, a companion might meet her at the door, taking the bucket from her hands, offering a nod or a touch that pierced the fog of hopelessness. A small victory that said she was seen, that her struggle mattered. Clients, too, could plunge the women into despair, their demands stripping away the fragile defenses built through rituals and resistance. A cruel word, a rough hand, or a dismissive glance could cut deeper than the sting of vinegar on raw skin, leaving a woman raw and exposed. She might serve a client with a blank face, her hands clenched to hide their trembling, her mind retreating to a place where his touch could not reach. But afterward, alone at the basin, she might falter, her rag moving slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The act of washing was meant to prepare her for the next client, but in these moments it was a ritual of despair, a futile attempt to scrub away the shame, the fear, the anger that lingered. Another woman might join her, their rags dipping in tandem, their silence a shared language of pain, a whispered word, a brush of hands, a shared glance. These were sparks of renewal, small victories that lifted her from the depths, reminding her that she was not alone, that her humanity endured. Yet renewal came as surely as despair, often in the smallest moments, woven into the fabric of their daily lives. A woman might sit in the early dawn, her hands wrapped around a crust of stale bread, the act of eating a quiet victory over hunger. She might break it in half, passing a piece to a companion, their fingers brushing, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared strength. The bread was dry, the taste bitter, but it was sustenance, a reminder that they could still nourish their bodies, still care for each other. Another woman might crush a sprig of mint, its sharp scent cutting through the brothel's heavy air, and rub it into her wrists. They act a small rebellion against the stench, a claim to something beautiful. She might share it with another, their hands touching as they passed the leaf, their smiles faint but real, a spark of renewal that lit up the gloom. Laughter, though rare, was a powerful source of renewal, a defiant burst of joy that pierced the brothel's despair. In the quiet moments between clients, when the keeper was distracted, a woman might whisper a joke, mimicking a client's pompous tone or the keeper's sharp commands. The laughter was soft, stifled to avoid detection, but it was a victory, a moment when the women reclaimed their spirits. Their shoulders might shake, their hands covering their mouths, their eyes bright with a joy that the brothel could not extinguish. Another might join in, their laughter mingling, a fragile thread that bound them together. These moments were fleeting, easily shattered by a creak of the door or a shout from the keeper. But they were enough to lift the women from despair, to remind them that they could still feel, still connect, still live. Memories, too, were a source of renewal, a way to reclaim pieces of themselves that the brothel sought to erase. In the dark, when the candle burned low and the room was still, a woman might lie on her straw pile, her hands folded over her chest, and let her mind wander to a life before. She might see a river, its water cool and clear, or hear a child's voice calling her name, the sound so vivid it brought a smile to her lips. These memories were painful, carrying the weight of loss, but they were also grounding, a reminder of who she was beyond the brothel's walls. She might whisper them to a companion, her voice soft, the act of sharing a victory over silence. The listener would nod, her own eyes glistening, her hand resting on her companion's arm, a silent promise that these memories were worth holding on to. These moments of renewal, born from the pain of memory, were a testament to their resilience, a refusal to let the brothel claim their entire selves. The cycles of despair and renewal were not separate but intertwined, each feeding the other, shaping the women's endurance. Despair stripped them bare, exposing their pain, their fear, their longing, but it also made the moments of renewal sweeter, more vital. A woman might cry at the basin, her hands trembling, only to find strength in a companion's touch, her resolve hardened by the act of being seen. Another might laugh through her tears, the sound a defiance of the brothel's weight, a reminder that she could still find joy. The basin, the rags, the combs, the straw, these were the tools of their labor. But their tears, their laughter, their shared moments were the tools of their survival, weaving a rhythm that carried them through the chaos. They faced the clients, the keeper, the endless tasks, with bodies worn but unbroken, with spirits tempered by the cycles of despair and renewal, with an endurance that was their greatest strength. The brothel's rhythm was relentless, a tide that threatened to drown them. But in these cycles, the women found a way to endure. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of straw, smoke, and herbs, but in these moments seemed to lighten, to offer a breath of something human, something alive. They navigated the ebb and flow of hopelessness and hope, their resilience, forged in the crucible of their emotional landscape, their survival a quiet rebellion against a world that sought to break them. The medieval brothel was a world of unrelenting confinement, its stone walls and heavy air, a prison that bound the women to a cycle of labor as unyielding as the seasons. The stench of sweat, smoke, and unwashed skin clung to every surface, a constant assault on the senses, while the rhythm of washing, working, and waiting ground their days into a haze of exhaustion. Yet within this oppressive world, the women carried the weight of memory and loss, haunting recollections of lives left behind that surfaced in the quiet moments, piercing their hearts with both pain and purpose. These memories of villages, families, moments of joy or sorrow before the brothel claimed them were a double-edged sword, burdening them with grief for what was lost, but sustaining them with a sense of self that the brothel could not erase. The basin, the rags, the combs, the straw, these were the tools of their labor, but their memories, their whispered stories, their silent longings were the threads of their identity. Weaving a fragile but enduring strength, it carried them. Through their daily struggle, memory often came in the stillness of the night, when the candle's flame flickered low, casting uneven shadows across the straw-strewn floor. A woman might lie on her pile of damp straw, her body curled against the cold, her hands pressed to her chest as if to hold her heart together. The brothel was quiet, save for the soft creak of the walls, the distant drip of water from the basin, or the faint rustle of a companion shifting in her sleep. In this silence her mind would wander unbidden to a life before a meadow where she ran as a child, the grass cool beneath her bare feet, the air sweet with wildflowers. She might see her mother's face, lined with worry but softened by love, or hear her father's voice, rough but kind, calling her name across a village square. These memories were vivid, almost tangible, their colors bright against the brothel's gray gloom, but they carried a sharp ache, a reminder of what was gone. Her breath might catch, her eyes glistening in the dark, her fingers clutching the straw as if to anchor herself to the present, to keep the past from pulling her under. The basin was a frequent trigger for these memories, its cloudy water a mirror to the women's pasts. A woman might stand before it, her rag dripping, her hands moving mechanically to scrub her skin, when a memory would surface, a river where she swam, its water clear and cold, so different from the basin's oily sheen. She might pause, her rag suspended, her eyes staring into the water's depths, seeing not her reflection but a moment from her childhood, a summer day, the sun warm on her skin, laughter echoing across the banks. The memory was a wound, its joy now laced with loss, but it was also a lifeline, a reminder of who she was before the brothel's walls closed in. Her hands might tremble, the rag slipping to the floor, her breath uneven as she fought to hold on to the image. Another woman might notice, her own hands slowing, her glance soft but cautious, knowing the keeper's eyes were never far. She might step closer, her shoulder brushing against her companion's, offering a wordless comfort that said the memory was valid, that it mattered. This moment of connection, born from shared loss, was a thread that bound them, sustaining them through the day's labor. The act of combing hair was another ritual where memories surfaced, each stroke a pull on the past. The combs, crude and splintered, were shared among the women, their teeth worn from countless tangles. A woman might sit cross-legged on the straw, her companion behind her, the comb scraping through matted hair, each tug pulling a wince or a sharp breath. The act was painful, the scalp tender from lice and neglect, but it was also intimate, a moment when memories could spill out. She might recall her mother braiding her hair, her fingers gentle, her voice humming a lullaby, or a sister teasing her about a knot, their laughter filling a long-gone room. The memory would hit like a wave, her hands faltering, her eyes glistening as she stared at the straw, its damp fibers a stark contrast to the warmth of her past. Her companion might pause, the comb still, her hand resting on her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the weight she carried. These memories were a burden, heavy with loss, but they were also a strength, a reminder that she had once been more than the brothel's laborer, that some part of her still was. The herbs, those precious sprigs of rosemary, thyme, or mint, were another gateway to memory, their scents a bridge to lives left behind. A woman might crush a leaf between her fingers, its sharp aroma cutting through the brothel's heavy air, and be transported to a garden where she picked herbs with her grandmother. The earth soft beneath her knees, the air alive with possibility. She might rub the leaf into her wrists, the scent a fleeting shield against the stench of sweat and smoke, but also a reminder of a time when her hands were her own, when her labor was for love, not survival. She might share the leaf with a companion, their fingers brushing as they passed it, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared longing. The act of sharing was a ritual, a way to honor their memories, to keep them alive in a place that sought to erase them. Another woman might burn a sprig in a clay pot, the smoke curling upward, carrying her back to a village fire. The warmth of community, the voices of those she had lost. These moments were fragile, easily shattered by the keeper's shout or a client's arrival, but they were enough to sustain her, to remind her that her past was not gone, only buried. The bucket, always full by morning, its contents sloshing with a sour stench, was a grim reminder of their present, but it too could trigger memories of loss. A woman might carry it to the street, her arms straining, her bare feet slipping on the cobblestones, and remember a well in her village, where she drew water with her sisters, their laughter mingling with the splash of buckets. The memory was a knife cutting through her defenses, leaving her raw as she dumped the bucket's contents into the gutter. The street was no kinder, with passers-by averting their eyes or whispering judgments, their voices echoing the scorn she had faced in her village when her choices or lack of them led her to the brothel. She might return, her head bowed, her heart heavy with the loss of that earlier life, but a companion might meet her at the door, taking the bucket, offering a nod or a touch that eased the pain. These moments of connection, born from shared memories, were a lifeline. sustaining her through the day's grind. Clients could stir memories as well, their faces or voices pulling the women back to moments they thought they had buried. A client's accent might remind a woman of a brother, his words sharp with the same cadence, or his hands might carry the calluses of a farmer, like her father's, sparking a memory of a harvest festival, the fields golden under the sun. These memories were not always kind. They often carried the weight of betrayal, of families who turned away, of choices forced by hunger or violence, but they were hers, a piece of her that the brothel could not claim. She might serve the client with a blank face, her hands clenched to hide their trembling, her mind clinging to the memory as a source of strength. Afterward, at the basin, she might scrub harder, her rag moving over her skin as if to wash away not just the client's touch but the pain of what was lost. Another woman might join her, their rags dipping in tandem, their silence a shared language of loss and endurance. The keeper's presence was a constant reminder of their present reality, their sharp voice and sharper punishments a barrier to the past. A woman might falter under a barked order, her hand shaking as she swept the straw or carried the bucket, the keeper's gaze heavy with judgment, the memory of a kinder authority apparent. A village elder might surface, the contrast stark and painful, leaving her raw and exposed. She might pause, her broom still, her eyes glistening as she remembered a time when she was more than a laborer, more than a body for hire. A companion might notice, her own hands slowing, her glance soft but cautious, offering a word or a touch that grounded her, pulling her back from the edge of despair. These moments of memory and loss were heavy, but they were also a source of resolve, a reminder that she had once been loved, that she could still carry that love within her. The women shared these memories in the dark, when the brothel was still and the keepers slept, their voices low, their words a fragile offering. A woman might whisper of a market, the stalls bright with colors, the air thick with the scent of bread and spices, or of a church, its silence a refuge from the world's noise. Another might speak of a child, her own or one she left behind, the memory a wound that never healed but also a spark that kept her going. The act of sharing was a rebellion, a refusal to let the brothel erase their pasts, a way to weave their stories into the fabric of their survival. The listener would nod, her own eyes glistening, her hand resting on her companion's arm, a silent promise that these memories were worth holding on to, that they were worth fighting for. These moments of memory and loss were not just burdens, but anchors, grounding the women in a sense of self that the brothel could not destroy. The pain of what was lost was heavy, but it was also a reminder that they had lived, loved, and been loved, that they were more than the labor they performed. They faced the basin, the clients, the keeper, with bodies worn but unbroken, with spirits tempered by the weight of their memories, with a resilience that was their greatest strength. The medieval brothel was a sealed world of stone and stench, its walls and heavy air a relentless cage that bound the women to a cycle of labor as unyielding as the tides. The odor of sweat, smoke, and unwashed skin saturated every corner, a suffocating reminder of their confinement, while the rhythm of washing, working, and waiting ground their bodies and spirits into a haze of exhaustion. Yet, within this oppressive world, there were fleeting connections with outsiders, rare interactions with people beyond the brothels, walls, merchants, washerwomen, priests or passers-by that offered glimpses of humanity, moments of recognition that pierced the brothel's isolation. These encounters, brief as a breath of fresh air, were not escapes but lifelines, sparks of kindness, judgment, or indifference that reminded the women of a world beyond their labor, sustaining their endurance. In the face of despair, the basin, the rags, the combs, the straw, these were the tools of their daily grind. But their interactions with outsiders, their shared glances, their whispered exchanges were the threads of their humanity, weaving a fragile but enduring strength that carried them through their struggle. These connections often came during the rare tasks that took the women outside, moments when they stepped beyond the brothel's creaking door into the chaotic pulse of the medieval city. Fetching water was one such task, a necessity that sent a woman to the well or river, her arms straining under the weight of a wooden bucket, her bare feet slipping on the uneven cobblestones. The air outside was a shock, sharp with the tang of wood smoke, horse dung, and the faint sweetness of dew, a stark contrast to the brothel's heavy miasma. At the well, she would stand among washerwomen and servants, their voices a low hum of gossip, their eyes darting toward her with curiosity or scorn. A woman might lower her bucket into the water, its surface rippling with the promise of something clean, and catch the gaze of a washerwoman, her hands rough from scrubbing, her nod a small gesture of acknowledgement. "Careful, it's heavy," she might say, her voice gruff but not unkind, offering a moment of connection that warmed the woman's heart. She would carry that nod back to the brothel, its weight lighter than the bucket but heavier with meaning, a reminder that she was seen, that she existed beyond the walls. The riverbank was another place of encounter, where the women rinsed their rags or dresses in water that was rarely cleaner than the basin they left behind. The mud was slick under their knees, the air thick with the stench of the city's waste fish bones, vegetable peels, the occasional dead rat, but it was a world alive with voices, movement, life. A woman might scrub her rag against a rock, her hands numb from the cold, when a fisherman's wife, her own hands busy with nets, would offer a glance, her eyes soft with understanding. "Hard work, isn't it?" she might say, her words simple but heavy, a recognition of shared labor. The woman would nod, her hands pausing, the rag dripping as she savored the moment. A fleeting connection that said she was not alone. Might share a sprig of mint with the wife, their fingers brushing as they passed it. The act a quiet exchange of humanity that lingered in her mind as she returned to the brothel's gloom. The scent of mint a faint shield against the stench. The market was a vibrant, chaotic space where connections bloomed. However briefly, a woman might be sent to barter for herbs or cloth, her coin clutched tightly in her hand, her eyes scanning the stalls for a merchant who might not judge. The air was alive with the scent of bread, spices and sweat, the sounds of vendors shouting, children laughing, carts rattling over cobblestones. She might approach a stall, her voice low as she offered a coin for a sprig of rosemary, her heart racing at the risk of rejection. The merchant, his hands rough from years of trade, might toss in an extra leaf, his gruff take it a gift. That felt like a lifeline. She would tuck the rosemary into her dress, it sent a spark of beauty in a world of filth, and carry his kindness back to the brothel, sharing it with a companion in the dark, their whispers a thread of connection to the outside world. Another merchant might sneer, his voice sharp with disdain, but even this was a connection, a reminder that she was part of the city's rhythm. However marginalized, the church offered a different kind of encounter, a rare refuge where the women that could slip in during the quiet hours, their heads bowed, their bare feet silent on the stone floor. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of incense and wax, a stark contrast to the brothel's acrid haze. A woman might kneel in the shadows, her hands clasped, her lips moving in silent prayer. When a priest would notice, his eyes softening, for a moment, "God sees you," he might murmur, his voice low, his blessing a fleeting gift that pierced the brothel's isolation. She would carry his words back, their weight a quiet strength, a reminder that she was more than her labor, that her soul still mattered. Another priest might turn away, his silence a judgment, but even this was a connection, a moment that placed her in the world beyond the walls, sustaining her resolve to endure. Passers-by in the street offered fleeting but impactful connections, their glances a mix of curiosity, pity or scorn. A woman might walk to the river, her bucket heavy, her head down to avoid their stares, when a child's voice would break through, bright and unjudging. "Why is your dress so worn?" the child might ask, their eyes wide, their question innocent. She might pause, her lips curving into a faint smile, her answer soft but honest. "It's seen many days." The child's laughter, their wave as they ran off, was a spark of humanity, a moment that lightened her step as she returned to the brothel. Another passerby might spit, their words sharp with contempt, but even this was a connection, a reminder that she existed in the world, that her presence mattered, however harshly judged. These encounters were brief, often interrupted by the keeper's call or a client's arrival, but they were vital, offering glimpses of a world beyond the brothel's walls. The women carried these moments back, sharing them in the dark when the candle burned low, their voices low to avoid the keeper's ears. A woman might whisper of a merchant's kindness, her fingers tracing the rosemary in her dress, the scent grounding her in the memory. Another might speak of a priest's blessing, her voice soft but steady, the words a shield against despair. These stories were a currency of hope, a way to keep the outside world alive within the brothel's confines, a reminder that they were not entirely cut off from humanity. The act of sharing was a connection in itself, their whispers weaving a tapestry of resilience, their glances a silent pact that these encounters mattered, that they sustained them. The brothel's rhythm was relentless, a cycle of labor that left little room for anything else. But in these fleeting connections, the women found strength. The basin, the rags, the combs, the straws were their tools, but their interactions with outsiders, their shared stories, their quiet exchanges, were their lifelines, illuminating their humanity in a place that sought to extinguish it. They faced the clients, the keeper, the endless tasks, with bodies worn but unbroken, with spirits tempered by these glimpses of the outside world, with an endurance that was their greatest rebellion. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of straw, smoke, and herbs, but in these moments it seemed to lighten, to offer a breath of something human, something alive. The medieval brothel was a relentless prison, its stone walls and suffocating air a constant weight on the women who toiled within, their days consumed by the unyielding cycle of labor. The stench of sweat, smoke, and unwashed skin clung to serve as a pervasive reminder of their confinement, while the rhythm of washing, working, and waiting ground their bodies and spirits into exhaustion. Yet, within this oppressive world, the women forged silent bonds, unspoken connections that bloomed in the shadows of their labor, weaving a web of sisterhood that held them together against the brothel's chaos. These bonds shared glances, gentle touches, wordless acts of care were not loud or visible to the keeper's sharp eyes, but they were powerful, a quiet strength that fortified their resilience. The basin, the rags, the combs, the straw, these were the tools of their daily grind. But their glances, their touches, their shared silences were the threads of their sisterhood, binding them in a place that sought to isolate and break them. These bonds often formed in the quiet moments when the candle's flame flickered low, casting long shadows across the straw-strewn floor. The brothel was still, save for the soft creak of the walls, the distant drip of water from the basin, or the faint rustle of a woman shifting on her pile of damp straw. In these moments a woman might sit, her knees drawn up, her hands idle, her eyes meeting a companion's across the dim room. The glance was brief, a flicker of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of shared struggle. No words were needed there. Eyes spoke of exhaustion, of pain, of the stubborn will to endure. Another woman might reach out, her hand resting lightly on her companion's arm, to touch a lifeline in the dark, a reminder that they were not alone. The straw beneath them was cold, its fibers poking through their worn dresses, its dampness seeping into their skin. But in that touch there was warmth, a spark of connection that pierced the brothel's gloom. The basin was a central stage for these silent bonds, its cloudy water a shared burden that drew the women together. They gathered around it in the early dawn, their bare feet cold against the stone floor, their hands reaching for the rags that were never truly clean. A woman might dip her rag into the water, its surface slick with the residue of countless hands, and scrub her skin, wincing as the liquid stung raw sores. Her companion might stand beside her, their shoulders brushing, their movements synchronized, in a quiet rhythm. If one faltered, her hands trembling from exhaustion or pain, another might take her rag, dipping it into the water, pressing it back into her hand with a nod that said, "We carry this together." The act was small, easily missed by the keeper's watchful gaze, but it was profound, a bond forged in the shared labor of survival, a sisterhood that strengthened their resolve to face the day. Combing hair was another ritual where these bonds took root, the act intimate and grounding in a world that offered little tenderness. The combs, crude and splintered, were shared among the women, their teeth worn from countless tangles. A woman might sit on the straw, her companion behind her, the comb scraping through matted hair, each tug pulling a wince or a sharp breath. The act was painful, the scalp tender from lice and neglect, but it was also a moment of care, a silent pact between them. The woman combing might pause, her hand resting on her companion's shoulder, her touch a reassurance that went beyond words. Another might take her turn, their roles reversing, their hands moving with a gentleness that defied the brothel's harshness. These moments were a rebellion, a refusal to let the brothel's isolation sever their connection, a way to weave their fates together in the face of despair. The herbs, those precious sprigs of rosemary, thyme or mint, were a sacred part of their sisterhood, their sense a shared refuge in a place of stench. The women hoarded them in small cloth sacks, hidden beneath the straw or sewn into a dress's hem, their value greater than any coin. A woman might crush a leaf, its sharp aroma cutting through the heavy air, and rub it into her wrists, the act a quiet claim to beauty. She might pass it to a companion, their fingers brushing, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared strength. The act of sharing was a bond, a silent promise that they could still give, still care, despite the brothel's scarcity. Another woman might burn a sprig in a clay pot, the smoke curling upward, mingling with the tallow lamp's acrid haze. The others would gather close, their faces softened by the scent, their silence a shared ritual that said they were more than their labor, that their humanity endured. Meals were sparse, but they were a cornerstone of their sisterhood, a moment when the women could sit together, their knees brushing, their eyes meeting over a crust of stale bread or a bowl of watery stew. The act of eating was mechanical, driven by hunger, but it was also a ritual of connection, a chance to share more than food. A woman might break her bread in half, passing a piece to a companion, their fingers touching, their glances a silent vow of solidarity. Another might sip from a shared cup of sour wine, its taste bitter but grounding, a reminder that they could still taste, still feel, still live. The keeper might watch, their eyes sharp, but the women's silence was their shield, their glances a language that needed no words. These moments were fleeting, easily interrupted by a client's arrival or a barked order, but they were enough to strengthen their bonds, to remind them that they were not alone in their struggle. The bucket, always full by morning, its contents sloshing with a sour stench, was a grim necessity that tested their bonds but also deepened them. Emptying it was a task no one wanted, its weight a burden on the body and the spirit, but the women shared it, their hands passing the bucket from one to another, their glances a silent agreement to bear it together. A woman might carry it to the street, her arms straining, her bare feet slipping on the cobblestones, when a companion would join her, taking the handle. Their steps synchronized as they walked. The street was no kinder with passers-by averting their eyes or whispering judgments, but the women's bond was a shield, their shared labor a quiet defiance of the brothel's isolation. Back in the brothel they would set the bucket down, their hands brushing, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared strength, a sisterhood that carried them through the day's grind. These silent bonds were not without risk. The keeper's punishments were swift, their eyes missing nothing, their hands quick to strike at any sign of connection that threatened their control. A shared glance could earn a sharp rebuke, a touch, a withheld meal, a whispered word, a night in a cold corner. Yet the women persisted, their bonds a kind of armor, protecting their spirits against the brothel's relentless weight. They shared rags, herbs, bread, burdens, knowing the risks but choosing to connect anyway. Each glance, each touch, each silent act was a thread in the tapestry of their sisterhood, a way to weave their humanity into a world that sought to unravel it. The basin, the rags, the combs, the straw, these were their tools, but their glances, their touches, their shared silences were their strength, a quiet resilience that burned within them, illuminating their survival in a place that sought to break them. The brothel's rhythm was unyielding, a cycle of labor that left little room for anything else. But in these silent bonds, the women created their own rhythm, a softer, steadier beat that carried them through the chaos. The candle burned low, its wax pooling on the floor, marking the passage of another night. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of straw, smoke, and herbs. But in these moments, it seemed to lighten, to offer a breath of something human, something alive. They faced the clients, the keeper, the endless tasks, with bodies worn but unbroken, with spirits tempered by their sisterhood, with a resilience that was their greatest rebellion.